He looked at my 5-month pregnant belly and told me the baby was not his. He walked out of the hospital room and left me to sign the discharge papers alone. For 7 years, I raised our child by myself. Then out of nowhere, he appeared with a team of lawyers and custody papers, crying and begging to be a father. He put on a great show, right up until the judge read the legal name on my son's birth certificate. The hospital room was suffocatingly bright. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile, sickly glow across the peeling linoleum floor. I lay on the narrow emergency room bed, my body trembling uncontrollably as the cold saline from the intravenous drip traveled up my arm. The smell of rubbing alcohol and bleached cotton sheets made my stomach churn. Just 2 hours ago, I had been sitting at my desk at the accounting firm, reviewing a massive stack of corporate tax files when the panic attack hit. It felt as though a heavy iron block had been dropped onto my chest. I could not breathe. My vision had blurred into a tunnel of dark spots, and a sharp, terrifying pain had ripped through my lower abdomen. I am 30 years old, a forensic accountant who spends 80 hours a week dissecting complex financial fraud, but in that moment, all my analytical skills vanished. My only thought was the safety of my unborn child. The paramedics had rushed me to the hospital, hooking me up to monitors and machines to ensure my 5-month pregnancy was still viable. The steady, rhythmic thumping of the fetal heart monitor was the only sound keeping me tethered to sanity. I had called my husband, Bradley, 6 times from the ambulance. 6 times the calls went straight to his personalized voicemail. I needed him. I needed the man who had stood at the altar of our church 5 years ago and promised to love and protect me in sickness and in health. I needed the man whose student loans I had paid off with my grueling audit schedules, the man I had supported through every career setback until he finally landed a lucrative executive position. The heavy wooden door of the hospital room clicked open. My heart leaped with a desperate, pathetic surge of relief. I turned my head expecting to see Bradley rushing to my bedside, his face pale with worry, his arms reaching out to hold me. Instead, the air in the room instantly dropped to freezing. Bradley walked in slowly, his posture rigid, and his expression entirely devoid of emotion. He was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal suit, the exact suit I had bought him for his promotion last month. Not a single crease was out of place. He did not rush to my side. He did not look at the fetal heart monitor tracking the life of our child. His eyes were as cold and empty as a winter sky. Right behind him stepped his older sister, Abigail. She wore a pristine pastel cardigan buttoned up to her collarbone, a delicate silver cross necklace resting perfectly against the fabric. Her hair was styled in immaculate waves, and she carried her designer handbag tightly against her waist. She looked like she was arriving for a Sunday morning service at Grace Fellowship, not visiting her pregnant sister-in-law in the emergency room. Her lips were pursed into a thin, tight line of absolute disgust. I tried to sit up, but the sharp pull of the needle in my vein forced me back down. Bradley. I gasped, my voice barely more than a dry, ragged whisper. Thank God you're here. I was so scared. The doctor said my blood pressure spiked, but the baby is okay. The baby is holding on. Bradley did not offer a comforting smile. He did not reach out to touch my hand. Instead, he stopped at the foot of the bed and reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick brown manila envelope and tossed it casually through the air. It landed directly on my swollen belly with a heavy, dismissive thud. I stared at the envelope, my mind struggling to process the scene. What is this? I asked, my fingers shaking as I reached for the thick stack of papers spilling out of the flap. It is a petition for divorce, Bradley said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. It sounded like he was reading a quarterly earnings report to a boardroom of strangers. I want you out of my life, Clara. I am filing for an absolute dissolution of our marriage, and I am cutting all ties with you. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor seemed to grow louder, drowning out the buzzing of the lights. The words hung in the air, making no logical sense. I looked from the legal documents to his perfectly shaven face. A divorce. We had just painted the nursery pale yellow last weekend. We had just argued over whether to buy a wooden crib or a modern bassinet. I had spent the last 5 years of my life pouring every ounce of my energy, my love, and my paycheck into building our foundation. Bradley, what are you talking about? I cried, hot tears, finally spilling over my eyelashes and running down my cheeks. We are having a baby. We are starting our family. Bradley crossed his arms over his chest and looked at my belly with a sneer of utter revulsion. "That baby is not mine," he proclaimed, his voice rising in volume, echoing off the bare hospital walls. "Do not try to pin your bastard child on me, Clara. I know everything. I know about your affair with your audit manager." My breath caught in my throat. I felt like I had been violently shoved out of a moving vehicle. The accusation was so bizarre, so completely detached from reality, that my brain simply stopped functioning. My audit manager was Greg. Greg was a 60-year-old man who brought pictures of his grandchildren to the office and baked cookies for the accounting team on Fridays. I had never seen Greg outside of working hours in my entire life. I had never even looked at another man since the day I met Bradley. "I have never cheated on you," I pleaded, my voice cracking under the weight of the injustice. "I swear to you, Bradley, I have never been unfaithful. This is your child. This is our son. How can you even say something so horrific?" Abigail stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. She placed a hand on Bradley's shoulder in a grand theatrical show of sibling solidarity. "You should be ashamed of yourself, Clara." Abigail sneered, her voice dripping with performative piety. "You are a lying, manipulative sinner. My brother gave you a beautiful home. He gave you a wonderful life. He worked tirelessly to provide for you, and you repay him by sleeping around like a common tramp." I stared at Abigail, paralyzed by the sheer venom in her tone. This was the same woman who had happily accepted the thousands of dollars I had lent her when her own business venture failed. This was the same woman I had hosted for Thanksgiving dinner for 5 years in a row, cooking for days, while she sat on my couch complaining about the church choir. Now she was looking at me as if I were dirt stuck to the bottom of her shoe. The entire congregation at Grace Fellowship is going to hear about this. Abigail continued weaponizing our tight-knit church community like a loaded gun. "Pastor Miller would be absolutely disgusted by your behavior. You are a disgrace to the Preston family name. I always knew you were not good enough for my brother. You always cared more about your spreadsheets and your secular job than being a proper godly wife. Now you have ruined everything." I looked back at Bradley, searching his eyes for any sign of doubt, any flicker of the man I thought I knew. But there was nothing. He was standing there watching me cry, looking incredibly pleased with himself. "I want you out of my house," Bradley commanded, stepping closer to the bed and pointing a manicured finger at my face. "You have 24 hours to pack your bags and vacate the property. If you are not gone by tomorrow evening, I will have the police escort you out for trespassing. I am freezing our joint bank accounts immediately. You will not get another dime of my money to support your filthy lifestyle." The cruelty of his words hit me like physical blows. My money. For the first 3 years of our marriage, my salary as a forensic accountant had paid the mortgage, the groceries, and the utilities while he bounced from one failed startup to another. I had liquidated my own personal savings to buy him a reliable car so he could commute to his new corporate job. I had sacrificed my own comfort, my own peace of mind, to ensure he never felt the stress of financial ruin. And now he was standing in a hospital room, locking me out of the life I had built with my own 2 hands. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My heart raced, causing the medical monitor beside my bed to beep frantically, a high-pitched warning of my escalating distress. I placed both of my trembling hands protectively over my 5-month pregnant belly. Beneath my palms, I felt a tiny, fluttery kick. My son was moving. My innocent child was reacting to the violent surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. In that single agonizing moment, the thick fog of heartbreak began to lift, replaced by a chilling, undeniable clarity. My forensic accounting instincts, honed by years of analyzing corporate deception, suddenly flared to life. I looked at Bradley's immaculate suit. I looked at Abigail's rehearsed, self-righteous anger. This was not the chaotic emotional reaction of a man who had just discovered his wife was cheating. A truly betrayed man would be screaming in agony, demanding answers, breaking down in tears. Bradley was too calm. The divorce papers were already drafted, printed, and placed in a pristine manila envelope. The narrative of my supposed affair with a 60-year-old manager was too specific, too deliberately crafted to ruin my reputation in our conservative church community. Abigail's presence was entirely unnecessary unless she was there to act as a witness to my humiliation. This was a setup. It was a meticulously planned ambush. Bradley was not throwing me away because he thought I was unfaithful. He had fabricated the affair to justify throwing me away. He had written a script where he was the tragic, betrayed husband, and I was the villainous, unfaithful wife. He was discarding me, and he wanted to make sure I was too publicly disgraced and financially ruined to fight back. The tears on my cheeks began to dry. The desperate, pathetic urge to beg for his love evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard void in the center of my chest. I realized that crying in front of them was giving them exactly what they wanted. Arguing with a man who had already acted as judge, jury, and executioner in his own rigged trial was a complete waste of breath. I stopped trembling. I lowered my gaze to the thick stack of legal documents resting on my lap. I slowly ran my fingers over the crisp white edges of the divorce petition. The silence in the hospital room stretched out heavy and suffocating. Bradley and Abigail stood at the foot of the bed, waiting for me to scream, to plead, to throw a hysterical fit, so they could point at me and call me crazy. I refused to give them the satisfaction. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the sterile hospital air into my lungs, steadying my racing heart. I looked up, locking my eyes directly onto Bradley's. All the warmth, all the naive love I had carried for him for 5 years was dead, replaced by a gaze as sharp and cold as a knife. "I will be out of the house by tomorrow," I said. My voice was no longer a ragged whisper. It was flat even, and radiating an icy authority that made Bradley visibly flinch. "I do not want your house, Bradley, and I certainly do not want you." Bradley blinked clearly, thrown off balance by my sudden shift in demeanor. He opened his mouth to speak, to deliver another rehearsed insult, but I cut him off. "Get out of my room," I commanded, pointing toward the heavy wooden door. "Both of you, get out before I call hospital security and have you removed for harassing a patient." Abigail huffed, adjusting her designer handbag on her shoulder. "You hear that, Bradley? She is completely unhinged. Let us leave this sinner to wallow in her own mess." Bradley turned on his heel, adjusting his expensive tie one last time. "You will be hearing from my lawyers, Clara. Do not try to contact me." They walked out of the room together, the heavy door swinging shut behind them, cutting off the harsh sounds of the hospital corridor. I was left completely alone in the glaring white room. I looked down at my swollen belly, gently rubbing the fabric of my hospital gown. They thought they had destroyed me. They thought they had left a weak pregnant woman entirely defenseless and broken, but they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had forgotten who I was. I was a woman who dismantled complex financial lies for a living, and now they had forced me to turn that relentless calculating focus onto my own life. They wanted a clean break, but they were going to get a war. I reached for the call button to summon the nurse. It was time to sign the discharge papers. It was time to go home, pack my life into boxes, and begin the brutal, necessary work of surviving. I was pushed to the absolute brink, standing on the edge of the abyss with nothing but the child in my womb. But as I pulled the IV from my arm and swung my legs over the side of the narrow bed, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Karma never misses an address, and I was going to make sure Bradley Preston paid for every single tear I shed today. The taxi ride back to my neighborhood was a blur of gray skies and pounding rain. When I unlocked the front door of the house Bradley and I had shared for 5 years, the absolute silence hit me like a physical blow. This was the home I had provided the down payment for. I had spent countless weekends painting the walls, planting Tijan hydrangeas in the front yard, and carefully selecting every piece of furniture to create a warm sanctuary for our future family. I remembered the long nights I spent at the dining room table, surrounded by piles of complex tax documents, working overtime just so we could comfortably afford the mortgage. I remembered eating cold takeout while Bradley slept peacefully upstairs, foolishly believing that every sacrifice I made was a solid investment in our shared future. Now standing in the dark entryway, the house felt like a cold tomb. The faint scent of Bradley's expensive cologne still lingered in the air, a sickening reminder of the man who had just discarded me in a hospital bed. I walked into the kitchen and saw the coffee mug he had left in the sink that morning. Just hours ago, he had kissed my cheek and told me to have a beautiful day at work. The duality of his deception was absolutely staggering. I placed my hand over my 5-month pregnant belly, feeling the gentle flutters of my son moving inside me. I needed to pack. I had 24 hours before Bradley threatened to call the police, but I refused to stay in this contaminated space a single second longer than necessary. I walked up the hardwood stairs to our master bedroom. Every step felt incredibly heavy, but my mind was beginning to clear. The blinding panic that had sent me to the emergency room was completely gone rapidly, replaced by the cold, calculating precision that made me one of the top forensic accountants at my firm. I pulled a large black suitcase from the closet and began tossing my clothes into it. I did not take any of the expensive jewelry Bradley had gifted me for our anniversaries. I did not take the designer handbags. I only took the clothes I had bought with my own hard-earned money, my personal identification documents, and the black and white ultrasound pictures of my baby. As I reached into Bradley's wooden nightstand to retrieve my spare car keys, my fingers brushed against a sleek silver object. It was his old backup tablet. He had claimed the screen was severely damaged, and he no longer used the device. I pulled it out of the drawer and pressed the power button. The screen illuminated perfectly, displaying the passcode prompt. Bradley was a creature of habit, arrogant and utterly predictable. I typed in his birth date. Incorrect. I typed in our wedding anniversary. Incorrect. I stopped and thought about the cold, calculating man who had stood in the hospital room earlier. I typed in the zip code of the luxury-gated community he had always obsessed over. The tablet unlocked instantly. My heart began to beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. I sat down on the edge of the mattress, the very bed we had shared for years, and opened the messaging application. As a forensic accountant, I tracked hidden assets and investigated corporate embezzlement for a living. People always leave a digital trail. They get sloppy. They get arrogant. Bradley was no exception to this rule. He had foolishly forgotten to disable the cloud synchronization between his primary smartphone and this forgotten backup tablet. A massive cascade of messages flooded the bright screen, loading months of secretly archived conversations. I did not have to search hard. The most recent conversation was pinned to the very top, belonging to a contact saved simply as Chloe. I knew that name from the corporate financial profiles I studied at work. Chloe Harrington was the only daughter of the billionaire founder of Harrington Logistics, one of the largest and most ruthless shipping conglomerates on the East Coast. Bradley had recently started consulting for their firm. I opened the message thread, my eyes scanning the harsh, undeniable truth of my ruined marriage. The texts were not just romantic sweet nothings. They were a brutal, transactional blueprint of my absolute destruction. A normal person might have thrown the tablet against the wall in a fit of hysterical rage. A normal person might have called their spouse, screaming and demanding a tearful explanation. But I was not a normal person. My entire career was built on the fundamental truth that numbers and data do not lie even when people do. I read the messages with the clinical detachment of an auditor examining a fraudulent ledger. I scrolled up to a conversation dated 3 weeks ago. Chloe had written, "My father loves your proposal for the supply chain merger, Bradley. He's willing to offer you the executive vice president position and a seat on the board. But you know his rules. He will not tolerate a messy public divorce or a scandal. You have to get rid of your drab middle-class wife quietly. If she fights you for alimony or the house, the deal is completely off." I read Bradley's response, the cruel words making my blood run completely cold. "Do not worry, baby. Clara is weak and obsessed with her pristine reputation at our church. I am going to tell her I know she's having an affair with her boss. I will threaten to expose her fake infidelity to the entire congregation and her conservative family. She will be so terrified of the social ruin that she will walk away without a single dime just to make it stop. I have already drafted the uncontested divorce papers. I will spring it on her when she's vulnerable. She will not fight back." I kept scrolling down the screen, the nausea in my stomach, twisting into a hard, burning knot of pure fury. Chloe had replied with a smiling emoji. "Good. I cannot wait to start our life together. Have you figured out what to do about the baby she's carrying?" Bradley's answer was swift and utterly devoid of humanity. "I will deny paternity. I will demand a DNA test and drag it out in court until she's too financially exhausted to continue. By the time the baby is born, I will be legally clear, and we will be living in the Harrington estate. I do not care about that child. I only care about our future, Chloe." I dropped the tablet onto the bed. The air in the bedroom felt thick and suffocating. Bradley had not been driven by sudden passion or a temporary lapse in marital judgment. He had orchestrated a meticulous, malicious plan to mentally and financially break his pregnant wife simply because a billionaire heiress offered him a better job title. He had fabricated a disgusting lie about an affair to specifically manipulate my fear of public shame. He intended to strip me of my home, my dignity, and the financial security I had spent 5 years building all to impress his new wealthy father-in-law. I navigated through the tablet settings menu, bypassing the basic security protocols with the ease of someone who uncovers corporate espionage for a living. I extracted the entire chat history, forwarding a compressed file to a secure encrypted cloud server that only I could access. I was gathering my ammunition. Every cruel word, every strategic manipulation was now preserved as permanent, irrefutable evidence. I stood up, walking over to the full-length mirror standing in the corner of the bedroom. The woman looking back at me was pale, her eyes red from crying in the hospital, her hair messy and completely exhausted. But as I stared deeply at my own reflection, I watched the naive, submissive wife die right there in that empty house. The Clara who baked pies for church bake sales, the Clara who worked 80 hours a week to pay her husband's debts, the Clara who begged for his love in an emergency room, she was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had just been handed the exact blueprint of her enemy's strategy. Bradley thought I was a fragile, terrified, pregnant woman who would cower in the face of his loud threats. He thought my fear of social judgment would make me sign away my rights and disappear silently into the shadows. He had vastly underestimated the ferocious protective instinct of a mother fighting for the survival of her unborn son. I walked over to the wooden dresser and picked up the brown manila envelope Bradley had thrown at me earlier. I pulled out the uncontested divorce petition. The legal jargon explicitly stated that I would waive my right to the marital home, to any future spousal support, and to any claim on Bradley's current or future assets. A week ago, I would have fought this document tooth and nail. I would have hired aggressive lawyers, drained my savings in legal fees, and subjected myself to months of agonizing court battles and tremendous stress just to prove my innocence. But now, with the baby fluttering in my womb and the knowledge of Bradley's true motive blazing in my mind, my strategy completely shifted. I pressed my hand against my belly, feeling the solid, reassuring warmth of my own body. My son was innocent. He did not ask to be brought into a world where his biological father viewed him as a disposable inconvenience. Bradley's messages had made it explicitly clear that he intended to use the legal system to drag out paternity claims, forcing me into a state of constant anxiety. Stress was the ultimate enemy of a healthy pregnancy. The hospital doctors had just warned me about my spiking blood pressure. Engaging in a prolonged, vicious divorce battle over a house I no longer wanted and a man I utterly despised was a massive tactical error. My primary objective was not immediate messy revenge. My primary objective was the safe, healthy arrival of my child. I needed to cut the infected limb off completely so the rest of my body could survive. I grabbed a black ink pen from the nightstand. I did not hesitate for a single second. I did not shed another tear. I flipped to the last page of the legal document and signed my name with firm, sharp strokes. By signing this paper, I was giving Bradley exactly what he wanted. I was handing him the grand illusion of total victory. Let him think he had successfully outsmarted me. Let him run back to Chloe and her wealthy father boasting about how easily he had disposed of his domestic problem. I knew that the higher he climbed in the Harrington corporate empire, the harder and more devastating his eventual fall would be. Before leaving the bedroom, I opened my personal laptop and logged into our shared banking portal. Bradley had threatened to freeze our joint accounts, but he had severely underestimated my speed and my access. As the primary earner for the first 3 years of our marriage, I knew every single password, routing number, and security protocol by heart. In less than 2 minutes, I transferred my entire personal savings, the money I had quietly set aside for my annual corporate bonuses, directly into a secure, newly created offshore account that Bradley did not even know existed. I left him the meager balance of his own recent paychecks, just enough to keep his fragile ego inflated. I closed the laptop, placed it safely in my bag, and zipped up my suitcase. I walked downstairs, rolling my heavy suitcase behind me. The wheels glided over the hardwood floors, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet, empty house. I paused by the front door and looked around the living room one last time. This space no longer held any emotional power over me. The framed wedding photos resting on the mantel looked like silly relics from a lifetime that belonged to someone else. I took the signed divorce petition, placed it neatly on the center of the kitchen island where Bradley could not possibly miss it, and laid my silver house key right on top of his printed name. I stepped out onto the front porch. The sky had turned a dark bruised purple, and a cold, relentless rain was pouring down, washing the suburban streets clean. The chill bit through my thin coat, but I did not shiver. I walked down the concrete driveway toward my car, pulling my suitcase through the gathering puddles. I was walking away from my marriage with nothing but a suitcase of clothes, my personal savings, and the tiny miraculous life growing inside me. I was completely alone in the world, cast out by the man who was supposed to be my lifelong partner. But as I opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat, I felt an incredible burning sense of liberation. Bradley Preston had won the battle today, but he had no idea he had just started a massive war with a woman who had the power and the intellect to dismantle his entire financial existence. I started the engine, the low hum grounding me in the present reality. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the neighborhood without glancing in the rearview mirror a single time. I was going to build an impenetrable fortress for my son, and when the timing was absolutely perfect, I was going to burn Bradley's shiny new world straight to the ground. The studio apartment smelled of bleach and damp wood. I had found it on a desperate internet search during my lunch break. It was a tiny, cramped box on the third floor of a walk-up building in a noisy industrial neighborhood. The radiator clanked all night, sounding like a heavy hammer striking hollow iron. But it was mine. I scrubbed the floors on my hands and knees until my knuckles were raw and bleeding. I painted the chipped, yellowing walls a soft, warm white. I bought a second-hand wooden crib and placed it in the corner right next to my small desk. Every time I looked at that little crib, the burning knot of anxiety in my chest loosened just a fraction. I was completely alone, but I was finally free from the suffocating lies of my past. My belly grew heavier with each passing week. The physical toll of a late-stage pregnancy with absolutely no support system was agonizing. My feet swelled so badly I could barely squeeze them into my sensible work shoes. My lower back throbbed with a relentless dull ache that made sleeping nearly impossible. But I refused to let the exhaustion defeat me. I spent my days organizing my financial portfolios, reviewing corporate tax laws, and plotting my triumphant return to the corporate world. I spent my nights rubbing my belly, whispering quiet promises to the child growing inside me. I promised him that he would never know the sting of abandonment. I promised him that I would build a financial fortress so strong and so tall that no one could ever tear it down. When the contractions finally started on a freezing Tuesday morning, there was no panicked husband grabbing an overnight bag. There was no one to hold my hand to rub my back or to tell me everything was going to be all right. I simply put on my coat, called a taxi, walked down the 3 flights of stairs, and rode to the hospital in absolute silence. The labor was brutal and terrifying. The pain ripped through my body in violent crashing waves, leaving me gasping for air in the sterile delivery room. The nurses looked at me with quiet pity, clearly assuming I was just another tragic single mother left behind by a careless man. I completely ignored their sympathetic glances. I channeled every ounce of my betrayal, every ounce of my anger, and pushed through the agonizing pain with a fierce, primal focus. When Liam was finally placed on my chest, my entire world shifted on its axis. He was so incredibly small, so fragile, yet his loud cries filled the cold hospital room with an undeniable life force. He had a shock of dark hair and tiny, perfect fingers that instantly wrapped tightly around my thumb. Hot tears streamed down my face, but they were not tears of sorrow or grief. They were tears of profound, overwhelming love. I looked down at my son and felt a ferocious protective instinct ignite within my soul. Bradley had called this beautiful boy a burden. Bradley had discarded him like a piece of meaningless trash. In that hospital bed holding my newborn son against my racing heart, I forged a brand new identity. The submissive, naive Clara was completely buried. A fierce, calculating protector was officially born. The first few months of motherhood were a relentless, exhausting blur of sleep deprivation and survival. My tiny apartment was constantly filled with the smell of baby powder and the bright glow of my computer screen. I established a brutal, unforgiving routine. When Liam slept, I worked. I rocked his bassinet with one foot while my fingers flew rapidly across the keyboard. I was meticulously updating my resume, analyzing current market trends, and studying the latest forensic accounting software until my eyes burned. I knew that my personal savings would not last forever. I needed a job, but I did not just want a standard boring paycheck. I wanted a position of absolute power. I wanted to enter a battlefield where I could utilize my razor-sharp intellect to completely secure my son's future. I applied to dozens of top-tier financial firms across the city. The rejections piled up quickly and ruthlessly. Corporate recruiters saw the gap in my resume and my status as a newly single mother as massive liabilities. They expected me to be distracted, tired, and unreliable. They smiled politely, offered generic corporate platitudes, and showed me the door. Each rejection letter only fueled my burning determination. I refined my approach. I stopped applying for standard, mid-level accounting roles and targeted the high-stakes aggressive departments that handled corporate restructuring, embezzlement audits, and multi-million-dollar asset recovery. I knew the complex language of deception better than anyone because I had literally survived it in my own home. My relentless persistence finally paid off when I secured an interview at Vanguard Financial Partners. Vanguard was a ruthless, prestigious firm known for managing the wealth of the city's most elite clients. The interview process was notoriously grueling. I walked into the sleek glass-paneled boardroom wearing a tailored black suit that perfectly hid my postpartum exhaustion. Across the long mahogany table sat 3 senior executives, their expressions bored cold and highly skeptical. They handed me a complex simulated financial portfolio and gave me 20 minutes to identify the structural weaknesses. It was a stressful test specifically designed to make desperate applicants sweat and crumble. I did not sweat. I looked down at the dense rows of numbers and felt my mind fall into a state of absolute chilling clarity. To me, the numbers were just a puzzle waiting to be systematically dismantled. Within 10 minutes, I found the hidden flaw. It was not just a basic structural weakness, it was a simulated embezzlement scheme buried deep within a subsidiary shell company. I pointed out the exact line items, explaining the fraudulent cash flow with cold, calculated precision. I traced the phantom money from the parent company down to the fake offshore accounts without missing a single beat. The executives stopped leaning back in their comfortable leather chairs. They sat up straight, their bored expression rapidly replaced by genuine astonishment. They had expected a nervous, desperate single mother begging for a chance. I gave them a financial predator. I was hired the very next day. Working at Vanguard Financial Partners was a daily baptism by fire. The corporate environment was aggressively competitive and unforgiving. My colleagues were ambitious, arrogant individuals who wore expensive designer watches and bragged loudly about their weekend golf games. They looked at me, a woman who rushed out the door at exactly 5 o'clock to pick up her infant son from daycare as a temporary fixture who would surely burn out within a month. I let them underestimate me. I let them gossip by the espresso machines while I sat quietly at my desk and systematically devoured the most complex, heavily guarded audit files the firm had to offer. My daily routine was a masterclass in sheer endurance. I woke up at 4 in the morning to prepare Liam's bottles and pack his daycare bag. I rode the crowded, noisy subway, using the long commute to review legal briefs and complex financial statements. At the office, I was an unstoppable, meticulous force. I uncovered hidden offshore accounts that entire teams of senior analysts had completely missed. I tracked laundered money through complicated mazes of dummy corporations with terrifying accuracy. The deep exhaustion seeped into my bones, making my muscles ache, but I never showed a single moment of weakness. I built an impenetrable armor of cold professionalism. My vulnerability was entirely replaced by an undeniable, radiating authority. I was rapidly becoming the sharpest weapon in Vanguard's massive arsenal. It was during a highly contentious corporate audit that I finally crossed paths with Harrison Cole. Harrison was a senior partner at Vanguard, a man whose towering reputation preceded him. He was 50 years old, distinguished, and incredibly wealthy. He had silver hair at his temples and wore immaculate bespoke suits that commanded absolute respect the moment he entered a room. He was a widower who had dedicated his entire life to the firm after the tragic loss of his wife a decade prior. Harrison was widely known for being demanding, brilliantly perceptive, and utterly intolerant of mediocrity. The firm had gathered in the main conference room to discuss a massive alarming discrepancy in a major client's quarterly earnings report. The room was filled with pacing senior partners and nervous junior associates. The client, a powerful manufacturing conglomerate, was threatening to pull their highly lucrative accounts if we could not locate the missing funds. The lead analysts were sweating profusely, presenting convoluted theories and pointing fingers at unpredictable market fluctuations. Harrison sat at the head of the table, his deep-set eyes scanning the room with silent, terrifying disappointment. I was seated at the very back, a junior associate, who was expected to simply observe the chaos and remain entirely silent. I watched the panicked executives stumble over their weak explanations. The numbers on the bright projection screen were blatantly lying, and I knew exactly how they were doing it. I could not sit quietly in the back row any longer. I stood up, the sudden movement causing the entire crowded room to fall dead silent. Every head turned to look at me, including Harrison Cole. I walked confidently to the front of the room, picked up the laser pointer, and directed it at a seemingly insignificant line item labeled as International Vendor Depreciation. "The money is not lost to market fluctuations," I stated. My voice was calm, crystal clear, and dripping with absolute authority. I did not stutter or seek permission to speak. I tapped the screen with the red laser. "The funds are being systematically siphoned through this specific vendor account. If you cross-reference the depreciation dates with the executive travel logs from the previous quarter, you will see a perfect alignment. This is not a clerical error. It is internal executive-level embezzlement, and it has been happening right under your noses for 2 entire years." The room immediately erupted in a chaotic chorus of murmurs and defensive shouts from the embarrassed senior analysts. But Harrison Cole simply raised his hand, and the room instantly went quiet again. He looked closely at the projection screen, his brilliant mind quickly processing the raw data I had just exposed. He then turned his intense gaze directly to me. His eyes were not filled with the usual corporate arrogance I had come to expect from men in his high position. Instead, they were filled with absolute captivated admiration. He looked at me as if I were the only person in the building who actually understood how the game was played. "What is your name?" Harrison asked, his deep, resonant voice carrying effortlessly across the large boardroom. "Clara Preston," I replied, meeting his intense gaze without a single flicker of intimidation. From that specific moment forward, my professional trajectory at Vanguard skyrocketed. Harrison Cole did not just see me as a clever junior employee. He saw my brilliant mind, my relentless hunger for success, and the fierce protective drive that fueled my every move. He pulled me off the crowded junior floor and placed me directly under his personal supervision. He became my mentor, my sponsor, and my fiercest advocate in the ruthless corporate world. Harrison easily recognized the heavy armor I wore every single day, and unlike other men who might have been intimidated by my cold exterior, he profoundly respected it. Under Harrison's expert guidance, I was given exclusive access to the most elite high-stakes accounts in the entire firm. We spent countless late nights in his expansive corner office, strategizing hostile corporate takeovers and unmasking wealthy fraudsters. We ordered late-night takeout food and pored over thousands of pages of encrypted financial data. During those quiet, intense hours, the strict professional boundary between us gradually began to soften. Harrison learned the truth about my past. I told him about the brutal abandonment in the hospital room, about the cowardly man who had discarded me, and about my beautiful son Liam. I expected polite pity, but Harrison only offered profound respect. He looked at me with a quiet reverence that began to heal the deepest, most broken parts of my soul. "You are a force of nature," Clara Harrison told me one evening as we finalized the paperwork for a multi-million-dollar asset recovery case. He looked at me over the rim of his coffee cup, his eyes warm and incredibly sincere. "You took the absolute worst moment of your life and you forged it into an empire. Any man who could look at you and see anything less than pure brilliance is an absolute fool. His honest words wrapped around my heart, finally mending the lingering cracks left by Bradley's cruel betrayal. Harrison did not just value my sharp intellect. He deeply valued my role as a devoted mother. He understood that my fierce ambition was intrinsically tied to my unconditional love for Liam. When my standard daycare arrangements unexpectedly fell through, Harrison insisted I bring Liam directly to the office. The intimidating, highly respected senior partner would happily sit on the floor of his luxury corner office building colorful wooden block towers with my giggling toddler while I finalized complex merger documents at his desk. Harrison slowly became a permanent fixture in our lives, a steady, unwavering presence of genuine care and absolute security. The difficult years passed in a rapid, triumphant montage of closed deals, promoted titles, and massive financial success. The tiny, cramped apartment with the clanking radiator became a distant memory. I purchased a sprawling, elegant penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city skyline. My old wardrobe of cheap, sensible clothing was entirely replaced by tailored designer power suits that radiated absolute success. I was no longer a struggling single mother desperately trying to make ends meet in a cruel city. I was a senior financial director, a woman who walked into crowded boardrooms and commanded total obedience. My vulnerability had been completely eradicated, replaced by a cold, calculating boss energy that made even the most arrogant corporate executives step aside. I had successfully built the impenetrable fortress I promised my son, and the foundation was completely bulletproof. 7 years evaporated like rain on hot asphalt. The terrifying passage of time did not age me. It refined me into a weapon. I was no longer the terrified, abandoned woman weeping in a sterile hospital room, clutching a pregnant belly while a coward handed me divorce papers. I was 37 years old, a senior partner at Vanguard Financial Partners, and I was absolutely terrifying to anyone who tried to hide dirty money. My office was a massive corner suite encased in floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the sprawling, glittering skyline of Manhattan. I wore impeccably tailored designer suits that acted as my modern armor. My mind was sharper than it had ever been in my entire life. I could dissect a fraudulent offshore account in minutes, stripping away the lies of arrogant billionaires with a single stroke of my red pen. I had amassed a personal net worth that would have made the old Clara dizzy with shock. But to me, the money was simply the mortar holding my fortress together. It meant my son would never know the sting of poverty. It meant we were absolutely safe. Liam was now 7 years old. He was a bright, joyful boy with a laugh that echoed vibrantly through our sprawling, pristine penthouse. He attended an elite private academy on the Upper East Side. Every morning I brushed his dark hair and straightened his crisp uniform tie. He knew absolutely nothing of the cowardly man who had discarded us in an emergency room. In Liam's eyes, the world was a safe, warm place, completely devoid of betrayal and cruelty. I guarded his innocence with the ferocity of a lioness. I provided him with every opportunity, every comfort, and every ounce of love that I possessed. The foundation of this new, brilliant life was entirely intertwined with Harrison Cole. Over the past 7 years, our dynamic had slowly and beautifully shifted. He was no longer just the imposing senior partner who had given a desperate single mother a chance to prove her worth. He had become my equal, my confidant, and the absolute love of my life. Our romance was not a chaotic, burning wildfire that threatened to consume us. It was a deep, steady river built on mutual respect and shared intellect. We spent our evenings sitting in my living room drinking expensive red wine and debating complex corporate restructuring strategies while Liam built elaborate wooden block castles at our feet. Harrison did not want to save me. He simply stood beside me, fiercely proud of the empire I had built myself. He never tried to diminish my light. He constantly pushed me to shine brighter. Harrison was a man of immense quiet power. He did not need to boast about his wealth or flaunt his success like the men from my past. His influence was woven into the very fabric of the city's financial district. Being with him taught me what a true, equitable partnership looked like. He admired my ruthless efficiency at the firm. When male executives from rival companies tried to speak over me in board meetings, Harrison would simply lean back in his leather chair and watch with a proud, knowing smile as I verbally dismantled their flawed financial models. He loved my strength. He loved the cold, calculating boss energy I brought to every single negotiation. I realized I was deeply in love with him on a freezing December evening. We had just closed a brutal, grueling audit that recovered $80 million for a defrauded client. I was exhausted, rubbing my temples at my large mahogany desk. Harrison walked in, gently closed the heavy oak door, and poured me a cup of hot black coffee. He looked at me with those perceptive, warm eyes and told me I was the most brilliant, extraordinary woman he had ever known. He did not propose with a flashy public spectacle. He did it quietly in the safety of our shared space, offering me a stunning, flawless diamond ring. He asked me to be his partner in every sense of the word. I looked at this distinguished, honorable man, and I said yes, without a single ounce of hesitation. I knew that with Harrison, I was making the best, most secure investment of my entire life. Our wedding was a quiet, profoundly elegant affair. We did not invite hundreds of shallow socialites or distant relatives who only wanted to gossip. We rented a private historic estate nestled in the lush green hills of the Hudson Valley. The air smelled of fresh pine and blooming white roses. I wore a simple, breathtaking silk gown that perfectly draped my figure. There were no nervous tears or dramatic speeches. As I walked down the aisle toward Harrison, holding Liam's small hand firmly in mine, I felt a solid, unbreakable peace. Harrison took my hand, his grip warm and incredibly reassuring. We exchanged our vows under a canopy of ancient oak trees. We promised to protect each other, to honor each other, and to build a life entirely free from deception. When he kissed me, the applause from our small circle of trusted friends echoed happily through the garden. I was finally part of a true, honest partnership. But the most crucial moment of our new life, the ultimate victory over my dark past, occurred 6 months after the wedding. Harrison loved Liam with an intensity that completely erased the biological void left by my ex-husband. Harrison attended every single soccer game, cheering loudly from the sidelines, regardless of the freezing rain or blistering heat. He patiently taught Liam how to ride a bicycle in Central Park, running behind him until he could balance on his own. He read him bedtime stories every single night, his deep voice lulling my son to a peaceful sleep. Liam naturally began calling him Dad. It was not forced or requested by either of us. It was simply the absolute truth of their beautiful bond. Harrison was the only father Liam had ever known. Harrison wanted to make it permanent. He wanted to offer Liam the ultimate shield of his legal protection and his prestigious family name. We initiated a formal step-parent adoption because Bradley had completely abandoned us and had actively denied paternity 7 years ago, refusing to sign the birth certificate or provide a single dime of child support stripping. His theoretical parental rights was a swift clinical legal process. Bradley was a ghost, a man who had willingly erased himself from our existence to pursue a wealthy heiress. We hired the best family law attorneys in the city to ensure the paperwork was airtight and completely bulletproof. I wanted no loopholes. I wanted no possibility of future complications. I wanted the man who threw my child away to never have the legal standing to even speak his name. We walked into the federal family courthouse on a bright, crisp Tuesday morning. I held Liam's hand on one side, and Harrison held his hand on the other. Liam was wearing a tiny tailored suit that perfectly matched Harrison's charcoal attire. He looked up at us with bright, trusting eyes, excited for what we had explained was a very special family day. We entered the courtroom and took our seats at the heavy wooden tables. The atmosphere was serious, filled with the quiet rustling of legal documents and the formal procedures of the state. The federal judge, an older woman with a stern but deeply kind face, sat high above us at the polished wooden bench. She methodically reviewed the thick stack of legal documents our attorneys had submitted. She looked at the comprehensive financial records, the rigorous background checks, and the absolute lack of any involvement from the biological father. She read the notarized statements detailing Bradley's complete absence from Liam's entire life. She noted the massive disparity between the man who had abandoned a pregnant woman and the distinguished man sitting before her, eager to take on the responsibility of fatherhood. Then she looked down at Harrison and Liam. She saw the undeniable love between them. She saw the way Liam leaned against Harrison's strong arm for comfort, completely relaxed and utterly safe. The judge smiled, a warm, genuine expression that instantly transformed the sterile courtroom. "Mr. Cole," the judge said, her voice echoing clearly across the silent room. "It is always a profound honor to witness a man step forward and choose to be a father. You have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that you are the true parent of this child." She raised her wooden gavel and struck the sounding block with a sharp final crack. The sound vibrated through my chest, sealing my victory. She officially granted the adoption. She declared that from this day forward, Harrison Cole was the sole legal father of my son in the eyes of the law and the state. There was no longer a biological placeholder. There was only Harrison. The court erupted in polite, joyous applause from our legal team. Harrison picked Liam up and hugged him tightly, tears of pure joy shining in his eyes. I stood beside them, feeling a monumental weight lift from my shoulders. A few weeks later, the newly amended birth certificate arrived in the mail. I stood in the bright modern kitchen of our penthouse and carefully opened the crisp white envelope. I pulled out the official state document and laid it flat on the cold marble counter. I ran my fingers slowly over the raised black ink. The section for the father no longer held a blank space or a painful memory of betrayal. It proudly displayed the name Harrison Cole. The legal weight of that single document was absolutely monumental. It completely severed any lingering ties to the cowardly man who had thrown us away. Bradley had no rights. He had no claim. He was a legally erased phantom. If he ever tried to return, if he ever tried to stake a claim on the child he had called a burden, this piece of paper would stop him dead in his tracks. I stood in the center of our massive penthouse, holding the birth certificate flat against my chest. Harrison walked up behind me, wrapping his strong arms around my waist and resting his chin affectionately on my shoulder. We watched Liam playing happily on the thick carpet, driving a toy car across the floor, completely unaware of the massive legal fortress we had just cemented around him. I closed my eyes, taking a deep cleansing breath. The panic, the poverty, and the crushing betrayal of my past were permanently locked outside our heavy mahogany doors. I was a wealthy, powerful senior partner at a top-tier financial firm. I was a cherished wife to a distinguished, honorable man who respected my intellect and my strength. And I was the mother of a son who was entirely legally protected from the demons of the past. I had built the ultimate shield. I had used my brilliant mind and relentless ambition to secure a life of absolute luxury and peace. As I leaned back into my husband's warm embrace, I knew with absolute chilling certainty that my family was completely untouchable. The afternoon air was crisp and carried the faint scent of turning leaves and expensive perfumes. I sat comfortably in the driver's seat of my black Mercedes SUV, the heated leather seeping a steady, soothing warmth into my lower back. It was exactly 3 o'clock on a Tuesday. The heavy wrought iron gates of Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy were just beginning to open for the daily dismissal. Around me, other wealthy parents and private drivers waited in a neat, orderly line of luxury vehicles. I adjusted the collar of my tailored cream cashmere coat and checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at me was composed, powerful, and utterly secure. My hair was styled in sleek, professional waves. A flawless diamond ring rested on my left hand, a constant, beautiful reminder of Harrison and the impenetrable life we had built together over the last 7 years. Everything in my world was perfectly scheduled, perfectly safe, and perfectly mine. I watched as the heavy wooden doors of the academy swung wide open. A stream of children in crisp navy blue blazers and plaid skirt poured down the stone steps. My heart did that familiar, joyful leap when I spotted him. Liam was 7 years old now, tall for his age, with a bright, infectious smile that could light up the darkest room. He was holding his heavy backpack over one shoulder, laughing at a joke his friend had just told him. He looked so happy, so completely untouched by the ugly realities of the world. I smiled, reaching over to unlock the back passenger door of the SUV. I was ready to hear all about his science project and take him home to the sprawling penthouse where Harrison was waiting for us. But the absolute peace of that autumn afternoon was about to be violently, brutally shattered. As Liam skipped down the final stone step and walked toward my vehicle, A shadow detached itself from the thick stone pillar near the academy gate. At first, my brain simply registered a man stepping into the path of the children. But as the figure moved closer to the line of waiting cars, a violent, icy shockwave crashed through my entire nervous system. The breath was instantly knocked out of my lungs. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. It was Bradley. 7 years had passed since the day he threw divorce papers onto my hospital bed and told me my unborn child was a burden. 7 years since he walked away to claim his billionaire heiress. The man stepping into the sunlight was a jarring, horrifying distortion of the arrogant executive I once knew. His posture was hunched and erratic. He wore a rumpled, ill-fitting suit that looked like it had been slept in for days. The crisp, tailored elegance he once obsessed over was completely gone. His face was gaunt, his jaw covered in a patchy, unkempt beard, and his eyes were darting around with a wild, manic desperation. He looked like a cornered animal, hungry and dangerous. Before my paralyzed brain could fully process his presence, Bradley locked eyes with Liam. A sickening, possessive grin twisted across his haggard face. Liam Bradley shouted. His voice was hoarse and cracking, cutting through the polite chatter of the schoolyard like a rusty blade. "Liam, it is me. Come to Daddy." My maternal instinct exploded with the force of a detonated bomb. The polite, composed senior partner vanished in a fraction of a second. I threw my car door open and sprinted around the front of the SUV, my designer heels hitting the pavement with heavy, desperate thuds. Liam had stopped walking. He looked at the strange, disheveled man shouting his name with absolute confusion and rising fear. Liam had never seen Bradley. To my son, Harrison Cole was his one and only father. This man lunging toward him was nothing but a terrifying stranger. I reached Liam just as Bradley closed the distance between them. I grabbed my son by the shoulders and shoved him forcefully behind my back, using my own body as a physical human shield. Liam buried his face into the fabric of my cashmere coat, his small hands gripping my waist in sheer terror. "Do not take another step," I commanded. My voice rang out with a ferocious, booming authority that startled the other parents standing nearby. I glared at the man who had once been my husband. "Get away from my son right now." Bradley stopped just 3 feet away from us. The smell of stale alcohol and sour sweat radiated off his clothes, hitting my nose and making my stomach churn violently. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving up and down. "He is my son!" Bradley screamed, his face turning a mottled, angry red. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You kept him from me. You stole my boy. I am his father, and I have rights." The sheer audacity of his words sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated rage straight into my bloodstream. He had abandoned us. He had explicitly denied paternity in a hospital room and refused to sign the birth certificate. He had spent 7 years ignoring our very existence, and now he was standing in front of an elite private school violently screaming that I was a kidnapper. "You gave up your rights the day you left me in that emergency room," I fired back, keeping my body solidly positioned between him and Liam. "You have absolutely no legal standing here. Leave us alone, or I will have you arrested." Bradley did not care about the law, and he clearly did not care about the public scene he was causing. The wealthy mothers and fathers around us had stopped talking. Dozens of eyes were locked onto the chaotic spectacle unfolding on the sidewalk. Some parents were already pulling their children away, while others whispered in shocked, hushed tones. Bradley fed on the attention. He thrived on the drama. "She is a liar and a kidnapper," Bradley yelled to the crowd of stunned onlookers, waving his arms erratically. "She hid my boy from me. She's keeping a father from his own flesh and blood. I am taking him home today." He lunged forward. His hands reached out, trying to bypass me to grab Liam's small shoulder. The physical threat was suddenly intensely real. I braced myself, ready to fight him with my bare hands, ready to tear him apart in the middle of the street if he dared to touch a single hair on my child's head. But before Bradley's dirty fingers could even brush against my coat, a massive solid force stepped between us. Thomas Harrison's personal security detail and our trusted driver had exited the lead security vehicle the moment the shouting began. Thomas was a former military operative, a man built like a brick wall with a quiet, lethal demeanor. He moved with terrifying speed and precision. Thomas grabbed Bradley by the collar of his rumpled suit and shoved him backward with effortless, overwhelming power. Bradley stumbled over his own feet and crashed hard against the brick wall of the academy. "If you reach for Mrs. Cole or her son again, I will break your arm in 3 places," Thomas stated. His voice was incredibly low, lacking any emotion, which made the violent threat sound like an absolute guaranteed promise. Thomas stood perfectly still, his broad shoulders completely blocking Bradley's path. Bradley gasped for air, rubbing his shoulder where he had slammed against the bricks. He looked up at Thomas, realizing instantly that he was physically outmatched. But as Bradley stood there, catching his breath, his manic, darting eyes began to take in the surrounding details. He looked past Thomas and finally really looked at me. He saw the immaculate tailoring of my cashmere coat. He saw the massive, flawless diamonds sparkling on my left hand. His gaze drifted to the sleek top of the line Mercedes SUV idling behind me and the secondary security vehicle parked just a few feet away. I watched the exact moment the realization hit him. The terrified, struggling single mother he had discarded 7 years ago no longer existed. He had expected to find a broken woman living in poverty. Instead, he was looking at a woman radiating immense wealth power and high social status. The wild desperation in Bradley's eyes instantly shifted into something far more sinister. I saw the raw, calculating greed flash across his face. It was the same look he had whenever he thought he had found a new, easy way to make money without doing any actual work. The fake, tearful father routine vanished completely. "You think you can just buy a new life and erase me?" Bradley spat his voice, dropping an octave into a vicious, menacing sneer. "You think your new rich husband makes you untouchable? That boy has my blood in his veins. He is a Preston. I am going to take my son back, Clara. I will drag you through every court in this city until I get what is rightfully mine. You hear me? I am going to take him." Thomas stepped forward again, cracking his knuckles, ready to end the confrontation physically. But I raised my hand, signaling Thomas to stop. "Get in the car, Liam," I said softly, my voice completely steady. Liam quickly scurried into the back seat of the SUV, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The lock engaged with a loud, secure click. My son was safe inside the armored vehicle. I turned my full attention back to Bradley. The initial shock and maternal panic that had flooded my system just moments ago entirely evaporated. The intense, blinding adrenaline cooled rapidly, freezing over into absolute calculating logic. The forensic accountant inside my brain fully awakened, analyzing the chaotic data standing right in front of me. Bradley had not come here because he missed his son. He had not spent the last 7 years agonizing over the child he abandoned. Men who are driven by genuine love and regret do not show up to a school unannounced, smelling of stale liquor, trying to violently grab a terrified child in front of an audience. Men driven by guilt seek forgiveness. They seek mediation. They do not seek a public spectacle. Bradley was here because he was desperate. His rumpled suit, his unkempt beard, the manic energy radiating from his every pore all pointed to a man whose life was entirely falling apart. He had married into the billionaire Harrington family. He should have been wearing bespoke Italian wool and stepping out of a chauffeured limousine. Instead, he was looking at my diamond ring with the ravenous hunger of a starving predator. The math simply did not lie. Bradley needed money. He needed it badly, and he had somehow convinced himself that Liam was the key to getting it. I looked at him with absolute chilling contempt. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream back. I simply let the full weight of my authority press down on him. "You are going to regret stepping out of the shadows today, Bradley." I said my words crisp and sharp as shattered glass. "You think you can threaten me. You think you can use my son as a pawn for whatever miserable, pathetic scheme you are running. You picked the wrong woman, and you picked the wrong family. If you ever come near my child again, I will not just call the police. I will dismantle your entire existence until you have absolutely nothing left." Bradley tried to muster a confident smirk, but his hands were shaking. "We will see about that in court," he sneered, though his voice lacked its previous volume. "I am his father. The law is on my side." He turned and quickly walked away, his shoulders hunched as he disappeared into the busy afternoon foot traffic of the city. Thomas stayed by my side, watching the perimeter until Bradley was completely out of sight. "Are you all right, Mrs. Cole?" Thomas asked, respectfully, keeping his voice low. "I am perfectly fine, Thomas," I replied, smoothing the lapels of my coat. The encounter was over, but the war had just been reignited. I got into the driver's seat of my SUV and looked at Liam in the rearview mirror. He was hugging his backpack, his eyes wide and uncertain. Who was that man? Maham, Liam asked, his voice trembling slightly. Just a confused stranger, sweetie, I said, offering him a warm, reassuring smile that hid the absolute fury burning in my chest. He was just a confused man, and Thomas made him go away. You are completely safe. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. My hands gripped the steering wheel with firm, steady resolve. Bradley thought he could disrupt my peace. He thought he could leverage biological biology to extract whatever financial gain he was desperately seeking. But he had no idea what he was truly walking into. He had no idea that Harrison had legally adopted Liam 5 years ago, severing every single biological right Bradley ever possessed. And he certainly had no idea that he had just challenged a senior financial partner who knew exactly how to track, audit, and destroy a fraudster's life. As I drove through the bustling streets of Manhattan, my mind was already racing, formulating a relentless, aggressive counterattack. I was not going to sit back and wait for Bradley's lawyers to file their frivolous paperwork. I was going to use every single resource, every connection, and every ounce of my forensic expertise to dig into his life. I was going to find out exactly why he was so desperate for money. I was going to uncover the rot hidden inside his marriage to the Harrington heiress. Bradley had declared war on my family to save himself, but I was going to ensure that by the time I was finished with him, there would be absolutely nothing left of his life to save. I drove straight from the private academy to the heavily guarded underground parking garage of Vanguard Financial Partners. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel with a terrifying white-knuckled intensity. In the back seat, Liam was safely buckled in, happily watching a cartoon on his tablet, completely oblivious to the monstrous threat that had just materialized on the sidewalk. I pulled into my reserved parking space and took a slow, deep breath, forcing the violent surge of maternal adrenaline to cool into a smooth, calculating block of ice. I escorted Liam upstairs to Harrison's massive corner office. My husband took one look at my face and immediately knew that the absolute worst had happened. I briefly explained the confrontation at the school gates. Harrison's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening with a fierce protective fury. He instantly offered to dispatch our entire legal team to crush Bradley by the end of the business day. I gently placed my hand over his and shook my head. I told Harrison to take Liam home to the penthouse and lock the doors. I did not want Vanguard's lawyers handling this. Bradley had brought a war to my doorstep, and I was going to be the one to personally burn his life to the ground. I walked into my own executive suite and locked the heavy mahogany door behind me. I did not pour a glass of wine to calm my nerves. I did not sit on the couch and cry. Crying is a luxury reserved for women who do not know how to fight back. I walked straight to my expansive glass desk, booted up my heavily encrypted dual monitors, and cracked my knuckles. I am a senior forensic accountant for one of the most ruthless financial firms on the East Coast. My entire career is built on tracking hidden money, exposing corporate liars, and destroying carefully constructed facades. Bradley thought he could just show up after 7 years and use biological intimidation to get what he wanted. He fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. He had just voluntarily handed his social security number to the apex predator of the financial district. I started by running a comprehensive background check on Bradley Preston. People who are driven by sudden manic desperation always leave a trail of digital breadcrumbs. They get sloppy. They make mistakes. I accessed secure banking databases, pulling public records, property deeds, and corporate filings associated with his name and his marriage to Chloe Harrington. On the surface, Bradley appeared to be a highly successful executive vice president at Harrington Logistics. His public profiles were filled with photos of charity, galas, luxury vacations, and perfectly tailored suits. But as I dug beneath the glossy veneer, the structural integrity of his entire life began to collapse rapidly. I traced his personal accounts and immediately found massive glaring anomalies. Bradley was hemorrhaging cash. I followed the money through a labyrinth of dummy corporations and shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada. He had been quietly liquidating his personal stock options and taking out massive high-interest loans against his marital assets. I tracked the outbound wire transfers and discovered exactly where the money was going. Bradley had developed a catastrophic gambling addiction. He was wiring hundreds of thousands of dollars to offshore sportsbooks and private equity lenders who operated completely outside the bounds of standard legal regulations. He owed over $12 million to incredibly dangerous people. My eyes scanned the glowing spreadsheets with a cold, relentless precision. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. Bradley was drowning in secret debt, but that alone did not explain why he suddenly wanted custody of a 7-year-old boy he had previously discarded. To understand his true motivation, I had to look at his new family. I pivoted my investigation to Harrington Logistics and his billionaire father-in-law. I pulled the corporate audit reports and discovered that the Harrington patriarch was notoriously ruthless. He had recently initiated a massive internal audit of the company's executive expenses. Bradley was weeks, perhaps mere days away from his father-in-law discovering the embezzled funds and the secret loans. Bradley was facing total financial ruin, complete social disgrace, and a guaranteed prison sentence for corporate fraud. He was utterly cornered. But why Liam? Why did this desperate, ruined man suddenly decide to play the role of a loving father? I dug deeper into the Harrington family tree. I searched the county probate records and found the missing piece of the puzzle. Chloe Harrington's grandfather, a fiercely traditional and wildly successful shipping magnate, had passed away 8 months ago. I downloaded the publicly filed documents regarding his estate and read through his last will and testament. The old man had established a massive generation-skipping trust fund. It was an ironclad legal structure holding exactly $50 million in liquid capital. I read the stipulations of the trust fund over and over again, the legal jargon revealing a monstrous layered secret. The $50 million was strictly reserved for the next generation of the Harrington bloodline. The capital could only be unlocked and distributed upon the birth or legal presentation of a biological heir. The grandfather had intentionally designed the trust to ensure the continuation of his family legacy. Adopted children from outside the immediate bloodline were explicitly excluded from accessing the principal funds. The icy dread in my stomach began to twist into a profound, violent disgust. I needed to confirm one final detail. I bypassed standard search protocols and utilized my highest-level forensic clearances to trace the private medical expenditures routed through a discreet Harrington Logistics subsidiary account. I am fluent in the language of wealthy people trying to hide their personal problems. I tracked a series of massive recurring payments made over the last 4 years to an elite, highly exclusive fertility clinic in Switzerland. The billing codes were specifically for advanced in vitro fertilization treatments, experimental reproductive therapies, and repeated failed embryo transfers. The medical billing history told a clear, devastating story. Chloe Harrington was completely infertile. She could never produce the biological heir required to unlock her grandfather's $50 million trust fund. I sat back in my leather chair staring at the glowing monitors in the dark, silent office. The true, horrifying reality of Bradley's sudden appearance washed over me like a bucket of freezing water. Bradley did not love my son. He had absolutely zero desire to be a father. He did not care about Liam's favorite color, his science projects, or the sound of his laughter. To Bradley, my beautiful, innocent 7-year-old boy was nothing more than a biological keycard. Bradley was a desperate, drowning man. His father-in-law was about to uncover his $12 million embezzlement scheme. His marriage was undoubtedly failing under the weight of his secret gambling addiction. He needed a massive influx of cash immediately to pay off the offshore lenders and save himself from federal prison. He knew Chloe could never give him a child to unlock the $50 million grandfather trust. So in his twisted sociopathic mind, he remembered the pregnant wife he had brutally abandoned 7 years ago. He realized that Liam shared his DNA. He realized that if he could somehow secure custody of my son, he could present Liam to the Harrington family lawyers, satisfy the biological heir clause of the trust, and instantly access $50 million. He intended to use my child to buy his way out of his own criminal mess. My heart pounded with a slow, heavy, predatory rhythm. The sheer, unadulterated evil of his plan was almost difficult to comprehend. He had thrown me away when I was vulnerable and penniless, leaving me to suffer in a cramped studio apartment. Now that I had done all the agonizing work of raising a brilliant, healthy child, he wanted to swoop in, steal my son, and use him as a pawn in a billionaire's financial game. He thought I was still the naive, submissive woman who would crumble at the first sign of a public confrontation. He thought his wealthy new family name would intimidate me into handing over my flesh and blood. I placed my hands flat on my mahogany desk. The rage I felt was not hot or chaotic. It was an absolute sub-zero blizzard. I was going to destroy him. I was going to dismantle every single lie he had ever told. I spent the next 6 hours meticulously compiling the evidence. I did not miss a single detail. I downloaded the wire transfer receipts proving his illegal gambling debts. I saved the internal corporate documents showing his desperate attempts to cover up the embezzled company funds. I printed the probate records of the grandfather's $50 million trust fund, highlighting the specific biological heir clause in bright yellow ink. I gathered the financial proof of Chloe's failed fertility treatments. I organized every piece of data into a thick, heavy red binder. This was not just a defense strategy for family court. This was an executioner's playbook. Bradley was currently preparing his expensive lawyers to hit me with a vicious custody lawsuit. He was planning to paint me as a bitter, alienating mother who had selfishly kept a loving father from his child. He was going to use his sister Abigail to spread venomous lies through our old church community, attempting to ruin my reputation and force me into a panicked settlement. He was completely unaware that he was walking directly into a trap of his own making. I picked up my secure office phone and dialed a private number. I needed to ensure that the audience for Bradley's upcoming downfall was perfectly curated. I reached out to a trusted contact within the financial regulatory sector who had direct ties to the Harrington Logistics Board of Directors. I anonymously leaked a very small, very specific breadcrumb regarding Bradley's unauthorized offshore wire transfers. I knew exactly how billionaire CEOs operated. Chloe's father would not just quietly investigate the rumor. He would become incredibly suspicious. I planted the seed that would guarantee the Harrington patriarch would personally attend any upcoming public hearings involving his son-in-law. Bradley wanted to use the Harrington wealth to crush me, so I was going to use the Harrington wealth to bury him alive. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Manhattan skyline when I finally closed the red binder. The city below was waking up completely oblivious to the absolute financial slaughter I had just orchestrated in my office. I locked the binder inside my secure briefcase. My mind was sharp, my strategy was flawless, and my family was legally untouchable. Bradley Preston had knocked on the door of a fortress hoping to steal a child. He was about to find out that the woman guarding the gates was heavily armed and taking absolutely no prisoners. The residual adrenaline from the terrifying ambush outside Liam's private academy still hummed quietly in my veins the following morning. As I sat behind the massive mahogany desk in my corner office at Vanguard Financial Partners, the lingering traces of maternal panic were rapidly freezing into a solid, impenetrable glacier of pure, calculating rage. Bradley had dared to step out of the shadows. He had dared to threaten the perfect, secure reality I had painstakingly built for my son over the last 7 years. The sheer audacity of his public spectacle confirmed everything my forensic instincts had already deduced. He was not a grieving father desperately seeking reconciliation. He was a cornered, drowning animal, thrashing wildly in the dark, hoping to drag my innocent child down into the murky depths of his own self-inflicted financial ruin. The heavy glass doors of my executive suite swung open, interrupting my cold reflections. My executive assistant stepped into the room looking visibly flustered and deeply uncomfortable. She was closely followed by a tall, stern-looking man wearing a cheap gray suit. He did not look like one of our elite corporate clients or a wealthy investor. He moved with a blunt mechanical purpose, entirely ignoring the luxurious surroundings of the top-tier financial firm. He walked directly up to my desk, pulled a thick, tightly bound stack of legal documents from his battered leather briefcase, and dropped them heavily onto the pristine glass surface right in front of me. He stated my full legal name, confirmed my identity, and bluntly announced that I had been officially served. Without another word, he turned on his heel and marched out of my office, leaving a suffocating, heavy silence in his wake. I dismissed my assistant with a calm, reassuring nod and locked the door behind her. I looked down at the massive stack of paperwork resting on my desk. The premium, heavily watermarked paper bore the imposing, highly recognizable crest of the Harrington Logistics Corporate Legal Defense Team. This was not a standard run-of-the-mill family court petition filed by a desperate ex-husband. This was an aggressive multi-million-dollar legal strike funded entirely by the limitless checkbook of a billionaire shipping empire. I picked up the documents and began to read. I did not shed a single tear. My hands did not shake. I processed the legal jargon with the exact same clinical detached precision I used when dismantling fraudulent corporate ledgers. The words printed on the pages were a masterclass in absolute staggering perjury. Bradley had filed an emergency ruthless lawsuit demanding immediate primary physical custody of Liam. But the foundation of his legal argument was entirely built on a mountain of malicious fabricated lies. Bradley swore under the penalty of perjury that I had committed deliberate, calculated paternity fraud. He claimed that I had vanished in the middle of the night 7 years ago, maliciously fleeing our marital home without a single trace. He painted a tragic, heartbreaking picture of a devoted husband who had returned from a hospital visit to find his pregnant wife missing. He legally stated that he had spent the last 7 agonizing years hiring expensive private investigators, tirelessly searching the country for his unborn child, only to have his efforts repeatedly thwarted by my cunning deception. The petition aggressively attacked the bedrock of my family. Bradley's lawyers were demanding a total, immediate annulment of Harrison's step-parent adoption. They claimed that I had committed extreme fraud upon the federal court by intentionally lying about the biological father's whereabouts. They argued that because Bradley was never formally notified of the adoption proceedings, his fundamental biological rights had been illegally stripped away without due process. The Harrington legal team was demanding mandatory DNA testing, full reversal of the adoption decree, and the immediate physical surrender of my 7-year-old son. I set the heavy documents back down on my desk. The absolute unadulterated evil of his legal strategy was crystal clear. Bradley was utilizing the aggressive shock and awe tactics favored by massive corporate law firms. He wanted to hit me with such an overwhelming, terrifying legal threat that I would instantly crumble under the intense pressure. He expected me to panic. He expected me to be a terrified, submissive woman who would eagerly agree to a quiet, lucrative financial settlement just to keep the Harrington lawyers away from my child. He was using the immense wealth of his new family to bully me into submission, entirely unaware that the woman he was trying to intimidate was a senior financial partner who literally destroyed predatory corporations for a living. Before I could even begin to draft a strategic countermeasure, my personal cell phone began to vibrate relentlessly across the glass desk. A sudden, massive flood of notifications illuminated the screen. Messages, missed calls, and social media alerts poured in with a frantic, alarming speed. Bradley's legal ambush was only the very first phase of his aggressive attack. He had simultaneously launched a vicious, highly coordinated public smear campaign to completely destroy my personal and professional reputation. I unlocked my phone and opened the primary social media application. The very first video on my feed featured a face I had not seen in 7 years. It was Abigail Bradley's wicked, deeply hypocritical sister. She had always sneered at my middle-class background, constantly whispering behind my back during our old Sunday church services. Now she had taken her malicious venom to the internet, weaponizing her fake piety for a massive audience. Abigail was sitting in what appeared to be a traditional church pew. She wore a modest conservative cardigan, her hands clasped tightly together in an expression of agonizing, desperate prayer. She stared directly into the camera lens, expertly forcing crocodile tears to well up in her eyes and spill dramatically down her pale cheeks. She posted a lengthy, tragic monologue, detailing the supposed heartbreak and suffering of her beloved brother. Her voice trembled perfectly as she spun a magnificent, completely fabricated narrative. Abigail boldly claimed to the entire world that I was a manipulative, calculating gold digger. She told her thousands of followers that I had selfishly used a minor temporary marital disagreement to steal a precious baby away from a loving, devoted father. She cried as she described how her poor brother's heart had been shattered into a million pieces when I vanished without a trace. She claimed that I had kept a loving father from his only son simply because I wanted to run off and secure a wealthy billionaire husband to fund my luxurious lifestyle. She begged the public to pray for Bradley, asking for divine justice to return the stolen child to his rightful biological family. The video had already been shared thousands of times. The toxic ripple effect was instantaneous and deeply devastating. My phone continued to buzz with messages from former acquaintances and members of our old conservative church community. People who had not spoken to me in almost a decade were suddenly flooding my inbox with horrible, vicious condemnations. They eagerly consumed Abigail's tragic narrative, loudly praising Bradley as a victimized martyr and branding me as a heartless, greedy monster. The women who used to gladly eat the pies I baked for Sunday charity sales were now openly demanding my public ruin. They called me a homewrecker, a kidnapper, and a disgrace to the concept of motherhood. The vicious smear campaign did not stop at the boundaries of my old neighborhood. Bradley and Abigail had strategically tagged major local news outlets and prominent financial blogs, knowing perfectly well that my high-profile marriage to Harrison Cole would make this a lucrative, sensational scandal. The toxic gossip quickly permeated the highly guarded elite circles of the Manhattan financial district. The pristine, impenetrable reputation of Vanguard Financial Partners was suddenly dragging through the mud of a cheap sensationalist domestic dispute. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of my office, looking down at the busy streets far below. I could feel the atmosphere in the corporate building shifting around me. The telephones at the reception desk were ringing continuously. High-net-worth clients were calling their account managers, nervously asking questions about the scandalous news articles popping up on their private feeds. Junior associates were whispering in the hallways, shooting curious, judgmental glances toward my closed executive doors. Bradley had intentionally orchestrated this massive public relations nightmare to completely isolate me, hoping that Vanguard would pressure me to quietly settle the custody dispute to avoid any further embarrassment to the firm. The heavy mahogany door to my office suddenly flew open, hitting the wall with a loud, violent crack. Harrison stormed into the room. The usual calm, distinguished composure of my husband was entirely gone, replaced by a terrifying volcanic fury. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. His deep-set eyes burned with a dark protective wrath that could have melted solid steel. He had clearly seen the emergency legal petition and watched Abigail's malicious fabricated video. Harrison marched directly to my desk, his large hands gripping the back of the leather guest chair so hard the wood groaned under the immense pressure. His chest heaved with suppressed rage. "I am going to completely annihilate them," Harrison stated, his voice, a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the quiet office. "I have already contacted the absolute best litigators in the country. We are going to bury Bradley and the entire Harrington legal team under an avalanche of injunctions and defamation lawsuits. I will personally ensure that Abigail is bankrupted by civil damages before the end of the month. They have absolutely no right to threaten our son. They have no right to speak your name. I will crush this entire miserable family into dust." His fierce, unwavering desire to protect me and Liam warmed the deepest corners of my heart. Harrison was a titan of industry, a man who possessed the wealth and the influence to completely obliterate Bradley in a traditional legal war. He was ready to deploy his massive army of corporate lawyers to violently rip the Harrington petition to shreds. Any normal woman would have eagerly stepped back and allowed her powerful husband to handle the terrifying threat. But I was not a normal woman. I was a mother who had been pushed to the absolute brink of destruction 7 years ago, and I had sworn to my infant son that I would never be a victim again. I walked away from the glass window and approached my husband. I placed my hands gently flat against his chest, feeling the rapid, angry beating of his heart. I looked up into his burning, furious eyes and offered him a calm, incredibly steady smile. "No, Harrison," I said softly, my voice completely void of any panic or fear. "You are not going to call the litigators. You are not going to deploy the firm's legal team to fight this in family court." Harrison frowned, his intense eyes searching my face in absolute confusion. "Clara, they are threatening to annul the adoption. They are threatening to take Liam. We cannot just sit back and allow them to control this narrative. We have to strike them with everything we have immediately." I stepped back and picked up the thick Harrington legal petition from my desk, holding it up in the bright morning light. "That is exactly what Bradley wants us to do," I explained, my tone shifting into the cold, clinical rhythm of a senior auditor dismantling a trap. "Bradley wants a loud, messy, traditional legal war. He's relying on the Harrington family checkbook to exhaust us in court. He wants us to engage defensively because it validates his completely fabricated narrative. He wants to drag us into a chaotic mudslinging contest to distract everyone from the actual terrifying truth of why he is suddenly so desperate to claim a 7-year-old boy he abandoned in a hospital. I tossed the legal petition back onto the glass desk, watching the papers scatter slightly. Bradley is not here out of sudden paternal guilt. I continued, my voice growing colder and sharper with every single word. He does not care about Liam. He does not care about being a father. He is drowning in millions of dollars of secret offshore gambling debt. His father-in-law is currently auditing his corporate expenses, and he is mere days away from federal prison. He needs massive immediate liquid capital to save his own miserable life. Harrison's eyes narrowed, his brilliant financial mind instantly catching up to the terrifying reality I was laying out before him. He wants the grandfather's trust fund. Harrison said, his voice dropping to a quiet, horrified whisper as the pieces finally clicked into place. The $50 million biological trust. Chloe cannot give him an heir, so he needs Liam to unlock the capital. He's literally trying to steal our son to pay off his illegal gambling debts. Exactly, I replied, a fierce predatory energy igniting in my blood. Bradley thinks he has orchestrated the perfect, untouchable scheme. He thinks his fake tears and his billionaire lawyers will terrify me into submission. He is banking on the assumption that I am still the weak, naive girl he threw away 7 years ago. I walked over to my secure briefcase and retrieved the thick, heavy red binder containing all the forensic evidence I had meticulously compiled throughout the night. I placed it securely in Harrison's hands. We are not going to fight Bradley in a family courtroom where he can hide behind high-priced lawyers and fake social media videos. I stated, my eyes locking onto my husband's with absolute unwavering resolve. We are not going to play his ridiculous, predictable legal game. If we simply block his petition, he will just retreat into the shadows and try again. I want to permanently remove his ability to ever threaten our family. Harrison looked down at the heavy red binder, sensing the absolute financial slaughter contained within the organized pages. He looked back up at me, the furious anger in his eyes slowly melting into profound, captivated awe. He recognized the terrifying, calculating woman standing before him. He recognized the apex predator he had mentored. "What are you going to do?" Clara Harrison asked quietly, a small, proud smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. "I am going to dismantle his entire existence myself." I answered, the cold, icy rage solidifying into an unbreakable weapon. I am going to let Bradley believe that his aggressive ambush was completely successful. I will let Abigail continue to spin her pathetic, pious lies to the public. I want them to feel absolutely arrogant and perfectly triumphant. I want Bradley to walk into a room believing he has finally won the $50 million prize. And at the exact moment he feels completely untouchable, I am going to use the absolute truth to burn his fraudulent life straight to the ground. The afternoon sun cast long, sharp shadows across the polished mahogany of my executive desk. The thick stack of legal documents from Bradley and his Harrington logistics lawyers sat exactly where the courier had dropped them. They were an ugly, arrogant threat to the peaceful fortress I had built over the last 7 years. Bradley thought he could use his billionaire-in-laws to terrify me into surrendering my son. He thought the vicious, fabricated smear campaign his sister Abigail was currently peddling on social media would shame me into submission. He was operating under the pathetic assumption that I was still the weeping, helpless pregnant woman he had discarded in a hospital room. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed a loaded weapon directly to a senior forensic accountant who dismantled corrupt empires for sport. I did not shed a single tear. I did not call Harrison to rescue me. I locked my office door, booted up my heavily encrypted dual monitors, and cracked my knuckles. It was time to systematically audit Bradley Preston's entire existence. I utilized Vanguard Financial Partners' top-tier tracking software, bypassing standard corporate protocols with the ease of an apex predator returning to her natural hunting ground. I wanted to know exactly why a man who had abandoned his child 7 years ago was suddenly so desperate to claim him. People driven by manic desperation always leave a digital trail of breadcrumbs. They get sloppy. They make mistakes. I accessed secure banking databases, pulling public records, property deeds, and corporate filings associated with Bradley and his marriage to Chloe Harrington. On the glossy surface of his public profiles, he portrayed the perfect wealthy executive vice president of Harrington Logistics. But as my fingers flew across the keyboard, tearing down the protective walls of his financial history, the catastrophic rot at the core of his life became glaringly obvious. I traced his personal bank accounts and instantly found massive, terrifying anomalies. Bradley was hemorrhaging cash at an apocalyptic rate. I followed the money through a convoluted labyrinth of dummy corporations and shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. He had been quietly liquidating his personal stock options and taking out massive predatory loans against his marital assets. I tracked the outbound wire transfers, my eyes narrowing as the final destination of the funds appeared on my screen. Bradley had developed a severe consuming gambling addiction. He was wiring hundreds of thousands of dollars to illegal offshore sportsbooks and notoriously dangerous private equity lenders who operated completely in the shadows. He owed over $12 million to people who do not forgive debts. The icy calculating machine inside my mind shifted into a higher gear. Bradley was drowning in secret debt, but that alone did not explain why he needed Liam. I pivoted my investigation directly into the Harrington family structure. I pulled county probate records and found the missing monstrous piece of the puzzle. Chloe Harrington's grandfather had passed away 8 months ago, leaving behind a massive generation-skipping trust fund. It was an ironclad legal structure holding exactly $50 million in liquid capital. I read the stipulations of the trust over and over again. The $50 million was strictly reserved for the next generation of the Harrington bloodline. The capital could only be unlocked and distributed upon the birth or legal presentation of a biological heir. Adopted children from outside the immediate bloodline were explicitly excluded. I needed to confirm one final sickening detail. Using my highest level clearances, I traced the private medical expenditures routed through a discrete Harrington subsidiary account. I found a series of massive recurring payments made over the last 4 years to an elite fertility clinic in Switzerland. The billing codes were specifically for advanced in vitro fertilization treatments and repeated failed embryo transfers. The story was absolutely clear. Chloe Harrington was completely infertile. She could never produce the biological heir required to unlock her grandfather's $50 million trust fund. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the glowing monitors in the silent office. The true horrifying reality of Bradley's ambush washed over me. He did not love my son. He did not care about being a father. To Bradley, my beautiful, innocent 7-year-old boy was nothing more than a biological keycard. Bradley was a desperate man trapped in a burning building. His father-in-law, a famously ruthless CEO, was currently conducting an internal audit of corporate expenses. Bradley was mere days away from his $12 million embezzlement scheme being exposed. He was facing total financial ruin, the collapse of his marriage, and a guaranteed prison sentence. He needed a massive influx of cash immediately to pay off the dangerous men he owed and replace the stolen company funds. He knew Chloe could never give him a child to unlock the $50 million grandfather trust. So he remembered the son he had thrown away. He realized that if he could use the Harrington lawyers to rip Liam from my arms and present him to the estate trustees, he could satisfy the biological heir clause, instantly access $50 million, and use my child to buy his way out of his own criminal mess. The rage that ignited in my chest was an absolute sub-zero blizzard. He had discarded us to chase a billionaire heiress, and now that his reckless greed had destroyed him, he wanted to use my flesh and blood to save his own pathetic life. He thought he could outsmart me. I spent the next 6 hours meticulously compiling the executioner's playbook. I downloaded the wire transfer receipts, proving his illegal gambling debts. I saved the internal corporate documents showing his desperate attempts to cover up the embezzled company funds. I printed the probate records of the grandfather's $50 million trust fund, highlighting the specific biological heir clause in bright yellow ink. I gathered the financial proof of Chloe's failed fertility treatments. I placed every single document into a thick, heavy-duty red binder. I organized it with tabs and color-coded dividers, making the complex financial crimes absolutely undeniable. This was no longer a custody battle. This was a complete dismantling of Bradley's freedom. But I could not simply hand this binder to a family court judge. Bradley would use his expensive lawyers to spin the narrative, suppress the evidence, and drag the nightmare out for years. To guarantee his immediate total destruction, the executioner had to be someone whose power Bradley feared more than anything else in the world. The executioner had to be his father-in-law. I opened a highly secure encrypted communication channel on my computer using a sophisticated virtual private network to make my digital footprint entirely untraceable. I navigated to the direct contact portal for the executive board of Harrington Logistics. I drafted a message addressed personally to the CEO using the cold, precise terminology of a high-level corporate whistleblower. I typed that a severe financial vulnerability had been identified within the logistics division of his company. I stated that a highly placed executive had been systematically diverting $12 million of corporate capital into offshore shell entities over the past 36 months to cover illegal gambling debts. I did not name Bradley directly, letting the suspense and paranoia take root. I knew a billionaire shipping magnate would instantly recognize the credibility of the specific financial terms I used. I concluded the message with a very clear, unavoidable directive. I informed the CEO that the individual responsible for this massive corporate theft was currently involved in a high-profile family court proceeding regarding a sudden custody dispute. I provided the exact date, time, and courtroom number of Bradley's emergency hearing. I stated that if the CEO wished to receive the complete, irrefutable documentation of the embezzlement and the identity of the thief, he must personally attend this hearing. I promised that the entire truth regarding the missing $12 million would be revealed on the public record. I hovered my finger over the mouse. Bradley had tried to break my spirit 7 years ago. He had abandoned me in my darkest hour. Now he dared to return and threaten the safety of my son. He thought he was a predator coming to claim his prize, completely unaware that he was a blind animal walking straight into a steel trap. I clicked send. The screen confirmed the secure delivery of the message. I closed the encrypted portal and shut down my computer. The silence in my office was absolute and deeply comforting. I packed the heavy red binder into my leather briefcase and stood up. I was going home to my husband and my perfectly safe child. Bradley Preston had exactly 3 days left to enjoy his pathetic delusion of victory, and I was going to let him fly as high as he possibly could before I personally burned his entire world to the ground. The heavy oak doors of the downtown family courthouse loomed before me like the towering gates of an ancient arena. 7 years ago, I would have stood on these very steps, shivering in absolute paralyzing terror. Back then, I was a broken, abandoned pregnant woman, terrified of my own shadow, and entirely convinced that Bradley Preston held all the power in the world. Today, I walked through those heavy doors wearing a pristine tailored charcoal suit and a pair of sensible razor-sharp designer heels. My posture was perfectly straight. My chin was held high. My mind was a calculating fortress of absolute ice. Harrison walked close beside me. His presence was a steady, grounding force of pure power. He did not hold my hand or offer useless nervous chatter. He simply projected the calm, lethal confidence of a man who already knew exactly how this battle was going to end. We entered the assigned courtroom and took our seats at the polished wooden defendant table. The room smelled of old paper floor wax and the undeniable tension of ruined lives. Across the aisle at the plaintiff table sat the man who had once called my unborn child a miserable burden. Bradley was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He was wearing a sharply tailored navy suit, undoubtedly purchased with Harrington Logistics corporate funds. But the expensive fabric could not hide the frantic, hollow desperation vibrating beneath his skin. He was surrounded by a swarm of highly paid, aggressive lawyers from the Harrington legal team. They were whispering to each other, shuffling through thick stacks of fabricated evidence, and shooting me arrogant, pitying glances. They thought they were dealing with a frightened civilian. They had no idea they were sitting across from a senior financial partner who had spent the last 72 hours completely auditing Bradley's pathetic, fraudulent existence. I let my gaze drift past Bradley and settle on the wooden benches of the public gallery at the back of the courtroom. Sitting perfectly still in the second row was a distinguished, intimidating man with silver hair and a deeply lined face. It was Chloe's father. The ruthless billionaire CEO of Harrington Logistics had actually taken my anonymous bait. He sat with his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes narrowed into cold, calculating slits as he observed his son-in-law. Bradley was so thoroughly absorbed in his own fake dramatic performance that he had not even noticed the apex predator sitting right behind him. The stage was perfectly set. The audience was seated. The execution was about to begin. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and the honorable judge, a stern man with decades of experience dismantling family disputes, took his seat at the high wooden bench. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the two tables. Bradley's lead attorney stood up immediately. He was a slick, fast-talking man who launched into an impassioned, entirely fabricated opening statement. He painted a heartbreaking, tragic portrait of Bradley Preston. The lawyer told the judge that his client was a loving, devoted father who had been the victim of a malicious, calculated campaign of parental alienation. He claimed that I had vanished into the night 7 years ago, stealing a precious unborn child out of pure spite and greed. Bradley played his part to absolute perfection. As his lawyer spoke, Bradley bowed his head and covered his face with his hands. His shoulders shook with fake silent sobs. He squeezed out forced crocodile tears, wiping his eyes with a crisp white handkerchief. He looked up at the judge with an expression of manufactured, agonizing pain. He swore under the penalty of perjury that he had spent his entire life searching for his lost boy. He demanded an immediate mandatory court-ordered DNA test to prove his biological connection to Liam. He aggressively requested that the court grant him sole primary physical custody of his son, claiming that I was a deceitful, emotionally unstable, and entirely unfit mother who had deliberately robbed a child of his rightful father. The lies were so thick and so vile that the air in the courtroom felt suffocating. The Harrington lawyers aggressively pushed their narrative, demanding that I be stripped of my maternal rights immediately to rectify this supposed historic injustice. They wanted Liam ripped from his safe, loving home and handed over to a man who literally viewed him as a biological key to a $50 million trust fund. I sat perfectly still. I did not gasp. I did not interrupt. I did not show a single ounce of fear or anger. I let the icy calm authority of my corporate training dictate every single breath I took. Harrison sat beside me, his jaw locked tight, radiating a silent, terrifying wrath. He wanted to crush them, but he respected my plan. I wanted Bradley to construct a massive towering monument of perjury right in front of the judge and his billionaire father-in-law. I wanted him to climb to the very top of his arrogant delusion before I systematically destroyed the foundation. When Bradley's lawyer finally concluded his dramatic, deceitful speech, the courtroom fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Bradley sat back in his chair, wiping his fake tears, a smug, triumphant smirk barely concealed beneath his tragic mask. He looked across the aisle at me, his eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation. He truly believed he had won. He believed the Harrington wealth and his aggressive legal team had successfully pinned me to the wall. He could practically taste the $50 million trust fund that would pay off his offshore gambling debts and save him from federal prison. The judge turned his stern gaze toward our table. He looked at my attorney, waiting for the defensive panic, waiting for the tearful rebuttals and the frantic objections. My lawyer stood up slowly. She did not raise her voice. She did not launch into a passionate counter-argument about my character or my fitness as a mother. She simply picked up a single slender manila folder from our table and walked calmly toward the judge's bench. "Your Honor," my lawyer said, her voice echoing clearly and evenly across the silent courtroom. "The defense will not be calling any character witnesses today. We will not be submitting any defensive exhibits regarding my client's exceptional fitness as a mother. We simply ask that the court review this single certified document before we proceed any further with the plaintiff's ridiculous custody demands." She handed the sealed folder to the bailiff, who promptly passed it up to the judge. Bradley's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His expensive lawyers exchanged confused, nervous glances. This was not the standard procedure for a messy custody dispute. They were completely unprepared for a defense that refused to play their chaotic, emotional game. The judge opened the folder. He pulled out the single piece of thick state-certified paper. The courtroom was so entirely silent that I could hear the harsh, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. The judge read the document carefully, his brow furrowed into a deep, confused line. He read the text a second time, his eyes scanning the official state seals and the federal signatures. Slowly, the confusion on his face morphed into a dark, irritated frown. He set the paper down on his desk and slowly took off his glasses. The atmosphere in the room shifted violently, dropping to a freezing temperature. The judge turned his cold, piercing gaze directly onto Bradley and his team of high-priced lawyers. The silence stretched until it became physically painful. "Mr. Preston," the judge said, his voice dropping into a harsh, entirely unforgiving tone that commanded absolute obedience. "You have just sat in my courtroom and allowed your legal counsel to present a deeply emotional, tragic tale of parental alienation. You have demanded mandatory DNA testing. You have aggressively demanded sole physical custody of a 7-year-old boy. You have accused the defendant of malicious kidnapping and severe maternal unfitness." Bradley nodded eagerly, leaning forward in his chair, still clinging desperately to his fake victimized narrative. "Yes, Your Honor. She stole my boy. I just want my son back." The judge slammed his hand flat against the wooden bench. The loud, violent crack echoed like a gunshot, making Bradley flinch hard in his seat. "You have absolutely no legal standing in this courtroom, Mr. Preston." The judge announced, his words ringing out with brutal, devastating finality. "The child you are attempting to claim today was legally, formally, and irrevocably adopted by Mr. Harrison Cole exactly 5 years ago." The entire courtroom froze. The Harrington lawyers physically recoiled their mouths, dropping open in absolute unadulterated shock. Bradley stopped breathing. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickening pale shade of gray. He stared at the judge with wide, panicked eyes, completely unable to comprehend the words that had just destroyed his entire scheme. The adoption was fully finalized by a federal family court. The judge continued lifting the certified document for the entire room to see. A comprehensive background check and a thorough investigation concluded that the biological father had explicitly and entirely abandoned the mother prior to the child's birth. The biological father completely failed to sign the birth certificate, completely failed to establish any paternal registry, and completely failed to provide a single cent of support for years. His parental rights, if they ever truly existed, were systematically and permanently severed. The child's official amended state birth certificate reflects that Harrison Cole is his one and only legal father. Bradley's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. He gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles turning white as he tried to keep himself from collapsing out of his chair. "But he is my blood!" Bradley choked out his voice, cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "He has my DNA. I am his biological father. You cannot just erase me. I need him. I need my son. Your biology is completely irrelevant in the eyes of the law," the judge stated, his voice a block of solid ice. "You chose to be a ghost, Mr. Preston. You chose to erase yourself. You do not get to magically reappear 7 years later, disrupt a stable, loving family, and demand access to a child who legally belongs to another man. This entire petition is a fraudulent, malicious waste of the court's time." The judge picked up his wooden gavel. He looked at Bradley with a profound, terrifying disgust. "This case is permanently dismissed with prejudice," the judge ordered. "The plaintiff is hereby ordered to cease any and all contact with the Cole family immediately. If you attempt to approach this child or file another frivolous petition in this jurisdiction, I will personally see you incarcerated for severe contempt of court. We are adjourned." The heavy gavel struck the sounding board with a final echoing crash. The execution was absolutely perfect. The trap had sprung with flawless, bone-crushing precision. I sat calmly in my chair, watching the absolute destruction of Bradley Preston unfold in real time. The arrogant, smug smile he had worn just 10 minutes ago was entirely shattered. His eyes were wide and frantic, darting wildly around the room as the devastating reality of his situation violently crashed down upon his shoulders. He had lost everything. The $50 million grandfather trust fund was permanently locked away from him. He could not present Liam as his biological heir. He had no child. He had no legal standing. He had no way to access the massive fortune he so desperately needed to save his own life. The $12 million in illegal offshore gambling debts were still hanging heavily over his head, and the dangerous, violent men he owed were not going to accept his excuses. Bradley turned to his highly paid lawyers, desperately grabbing the sleeve of his lead attorney. "Do something, Bradley," hissed his voice, entirely panicked and unhinged. "File an appeal. Tell him the adoption was a fraud. You have to get me that boy. I need him. I need him right now." The lawyer aggressively yanked his arm out of Bradley's frantic grasp. The legal team was packing their briefcases with furious, embarrassed speed. They had been publicly humiliated by a federal judge. They realized that their client had lied to them about his legal standing and led them into a catastrophic career-damaging defeat. "We are completely done here." Bradley, the lead attorney, snapped his tone, dripping with professional disgust. "You withheld vital legal facts. We do not represent you anymore." Bradley stood alone at the plaintiff table. His entire body was trembling. He looked across the aisle at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, horrifying realization. He saw me sitting there in my tailored designer suit, perfectly composed, radiating absolute power and complete security. He finally understood that I had known exactly what I was doing. I had let him file his aggressive lawsuit. I had let him bring his billionaire lawyers into the room. I had let him spend a fortune on this pathetic ambush just so I could pull the legal rug out from under him at the exact moment he thought he was victorious. Harrison stood up beside me, buttoning his suit jacket with a calm, dignified authority. He looked at the trembling, ruined man across the room with nothing but pure, unadulterated contempt. Harrison placed a protective, loving hand on the small of my back, guiding me gracefully toward the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. As we turned to leave, I watched Bradley look toward the back of the room, desperately seeking any form of support. His eyes finally locked onto the distinguished silver-haired man sitting silently in the second row of the public gallery. Chloe's father stood up slowly. The billionaire CEO of Harrington Logistics had witnessed the entire humiliating spectacle. He had watched his son-in-law completely humiliate the family name. He had watched a judge declare that Bradley was a liar who had abandoned a pregnant woman and a child. But more importantly, the CEO was now armed with the anonymous forensic data I had delivered to his secure portal. The trap was fully closed. Bradley was completely cornered. The biological key to the $50 million trust fund was legally destroyed, and the absolute hell of a corporate fraud investigation was waiting for him outside the courthouse doors. I walked out of the courtroom with my head held high, leaving the cowardly man to drown in the dark, inescapable abyss of his own making. The sharp, echoing crack of the wooden gavel striking the sounding block still resonated heavily in the stagnant air of the family courtroom. It was the sound of absolute, irreversible finality. The judge had completely dismissed the case with extreme prejudice, slamming the heavy door of justice directly in Bradley Preston's desperate face. I remained standing perfectly still at the polished mahogany defense table. My breathing was slow, measured, and completely controlled. Beside me, Harrison stood tall and unwavering, a silent monument of strength and protective power. I watched Bradley's expensive legal team scramble to pack their leather briefcases. They shoved their fabricated documents and useless legal briefs into their bags with frantic, embarrassed speed. They had been publicly humiliated by a federal judge, completely blindsided by the fact that their client had no legal standing whatsoever. They abandoned Bradley at the plaintiff table without offering a single word of comfort. They marched quickly out of the heavy oak doors, eager to distance their prestigious firm from the catastrophic wreckage of this failed ambush. Bradley stood entirely alone. The arrogant, smug smile that had plastered his face just minutes prior was completely obliterated. His complexion had turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His hands trembled violently as they gripped the edge of the wooden table, his knuckles turning a stark bone white. He was breathing in shallow, erratic gasps, his chest heaving under his rumpled navy suit. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in mid-air, waiting for gravity to drag him down into the crushing abyss. He looked across the aisle at me, his eyes wide bloodshot and filled with a raw, suffocating panic. He thought the worst thing that could possibly happen today was losing his frivolous custody battle. He thought his ultimate punishment was simply failing to secure his biological pawn. He was completely, tragically mistaken. The loss of his custody petition was not the final punishment. It was merely the opening act. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit. I did not sit back down. I did not gather my belongings to leave. The initial defensive phase of this battle was successfully concluded, and now the executioner was ready to take the stage. I picked up my sleek black leather briefcase from the table. The brass locks opened with a sharp metallic click that sliced through the heavy silence of the room. I reached inside and pulled out the thick, heavy red binder. It was packed with hundreds of pages of meticulous forensic evidence, color-coded tabs, and highlighted financial atrocities. It was the physical manifestation of Bradley's complete destruction. I held the binder firmly in my right hand. I turned my body away from the judge's bench and slowly faced the public gallery at the back of the courtroom. The heavy wooden benches were sparsely populated, but my audience of choice was sitting exactly where I needed them to be. In the second row, sitting with terrifying rigid stillness, was the silver-haired patriarch of Harrington Logistics. The billionaire CEO possessed a face carved from granite, his deep-set eyes narrowed into cold, calculating slits. He radiated a dangerous predatory aura that commanded instant obedience in any corporate boardroom. Sitting right next to him was his daughter, Chloe Harrington. She wore a dark, oversized designer trench coat and large black sunglasses, clearly attempting to hide her identity from any potential reporters lurking outside the courthouse. This was the woman who had sent text messages 7 years ago calling my unborn child a disposable inconvenience. This was the woman who had gleefully planned to strip me of my home and my dignity. I stepped out from behind the defense table and began to walk down the center aisle. My designer heels struck the polished hardwood floor with a steady rhythmic cadence. The sound echoed loudly in the cavernous room, pulling the attention of every remaining person in the gallery. Bradley turned his head to watch me, his panic suddenly shifting into a profound, paralyzing confusion. He did not understand what I was doing. He did not realize that his billionaire father-in-law was sitting just 30 feet behind him. I stopped directly in front of the low wooden partition that separated the court floor from the public gallery. I looked straight into the icy, unforgiving eyes of the Harrington CEO. He looked back at me, his expression entirely unreadable, but I could see the sharp spark of recognition in his gaze. He recognized the ruthless, unapologetic authority of a fellow corporate predator. I received your anonymous communication regarding a severe vulnerability within my logistics division, the CEO stated. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that carried an immense weight. You promised a comprehensive explanation. I expect you to deliver on that promise immediately. I did not smile. I did not blink. I extended my arm and handed the heavy red binder directly over the wooden partition. The CEO's private legal counsel, sitting to his immediate left, instinctively reached out to intercept the documents, but the billionaire raised his hand and took the binder himself. The heavy thud of the binder landing on his lap seemed to break the spell of silence in the room. Chloe pulled down her sunglasses, her heavily contoured face twisting into a mask of pure, arrogant confusion. She looked from me to the red binder, entirely unaware of the catastrophic bomb resting on her father's knees. The information you received was not a rumor, I announced, my voice projecting clearly and flawlessly across the quiet courtroom. It was a precise, clinically verified audit of your son-in-law's clandestine financial activities. Over the course of the last 36 months, Bradley Preston has systematically and intentionally embezzled exactly $12,450,000 from the primary operating accounts of Harrington Logistics. Chloe gasped loudly, her hand flying to cover her mouth. The CEO did not move a single muscle, but his eyes locked onto mine with a terrifying, absolute intensity. Bradley finally turned around. He saw his wife and his father-in-law sitting in the gallery. The blood drained so completely from his face that I thought he might faint directly onto the floor. He stumbled backward, his back hitting the plaintiff table with a loud thud. He did not steal this money to invest in the company. I continued, my tone shifting into the cold, rhythmic cadence of a senior financial partner presenting a fatal corporate review. He utilized a complex network of offshore shell companies. He established dummy corporations registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. He generated hundreds of fraudulent invoices for logistics consulting and phantom vendor services, routing the corporate capital directly into his personal, heavily encrypted accounts. I have mapped the entire digital trail. The routing numbers, the dates of transfer, and the fake corporate entities are entirely documented in the first section of that binder. The CEO opened the red binder. His eyes rapidly scanned the first page of highlighted bank statements. His jaw tightened instantly. The undeniable proof of the massive corporate theft was staring him right in the face. Where did the $12 million go? The CEO demanded, his voice dropping an octave into a vicious, menacing growl. I looked directly at Bradley. He was shaking his head back and forth, silently begging me to stop. I did not stop. The stolen capital was immediately wired to a series of illegal offshore sportsbooks and highly dangerous private equity lenders, I stated, ensuring every single syllable hit the air with perfect clarity. Bradley Preston has a catastrophic consuming gambling addiction. He has squandered every single cent of the embezzled corporate funds. He is completely bankrupt, and he currently owes massive unpayable debts to violent syndicates operating far outside the boundaries of legal financial regulations. The courtroom was dead silent. The magnitude of the fraud was absolutely staggering. Bradley was not just a liar and a cheat. He was a monumental corporate liability who had invited dangerous criminals into the Harrington family orbit. But I was not finished. The financial execution was only the first half of my plan. I needed to expose the truly evil, sickening motive behind his sudden appearance in my life. A massive corporate audit is currently underway at your firm, I said, turning my attention back to the CEO. Bradley knew that his $12 million embezzlement was going to be exposed within a matter of days. He knew he was facing total financial ruin, complete social disgrace, and a guaranteed federal prison sentence. He was absolutely desperate for a massive influx of liquid capital to replace the stolen funds and pay off his dangerous creditors. He needed tens of millions of dollars instantly. I turned my gaze to Chloe. She was trembling, looking at her husband with a mixture of growing horror and absolute disgust. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for her. Tab 4 of that binder contains the public probate records regarding the estate of your late father, I said, addressing the CEO. The estate includes a generation-skipping trust fund holding exactly $50 million in liquid capital. The legal stipulations of that trust explicitly require the presentation of a biological heir to unlock and distribute the principal funds. Adopted children are strictly excluded. The capital is entirely dependent on biology. The CEO slowly turned to tab 4, his eyes scanning the highlighted sections of his own father's last will and testament. Tab 5 contains heavily encrypted private medical billing records. Routed through a discreet Harrington subsidiary, I continued, my voice plunging into an icy, relentless depth. The records detail 4 years of advanced experimental fertility treatments at a private clinic in Switzerland. The medical coding confirms repeated failed embryo transfers. The documentation proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that Chloe Harrington is completely infertile. She cannot provide the biological key required to unlock the $50 million trust fund. Chloe let out a strangled, horrified sob. The absolute secrecy of her medical struggles had just been laid bare in a public courtroom. She stared at me, her eyes wide with humiliation and shock. Bradley knew he could not access the Harrington Trust Fund through his wife, I declared, raising my voice to ensure the entire room felt the crushing weight of his betrayal. So he remembered the pregnant woman he had brutally abandoned in a hospital room 7 years ago. He realized that the son he threw away shared his DNA. He came into this courtroom today, hired expensive lawyers, and wept fake tears about parental alienation. He did not come here because he wanted to be a father. He came here to steal my innocent 7-year-old boy. He intended to rip my child from his safe, loving home, present him to your estate lawyers as a biological heir, unlock the $50 million, and use my son to buy his way out of federal prison. The sheer unadulterated evil of the scheme hung heavily in the air. The absolute silence of the room was suddenly shattered by a piercing, hysterical scream. "You disgusting, parasitic monster!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. She vaulted over the wooden bench. Her oversized sunglasses flew off her face, clattering onto the hardwood floor. She lunged toward the wooden partition, her manicured hands curling into aggressive, vicious claws. She stared at Bradley with a manic, unhinged fury. "You used me. You stole from my family. You tried to use a bastard child to steal my grandfather's money. You are pathetic. You are nothing but a filthy, lying thief. I will destroy you. I will make sure you rot in a federal cell for the rest of your miserable life." Bradley raised his hands defensively, backing away from the partition as his wife continued to scream horrific insults at him. The bailiff stepped forward, placing a hand on his weapon, ready to intervene if Chloe managed to climb over the gate. The billionaire CEO did not shout. He did not lose his temper. He simply closed the heavy red binder, his face completely devoid of any human emotion. He pulled a sleek black cell phone from the inner pocket of his tailored suit. He dialed a private number and pressed the phone to his ear. "Connect me to the federal authorities and the head of our corporate security division." Immediately, the CEO ordered, his gravelly voice slicing cleanly through Chloe's hysterical screaming. "Freeze all executive accounts associated with Bradley Preston. Lock down his office. Initiate immediate criminal fraud proceedings. Tell the authorities we have full documented evidence of a $12 million embezzlement scheme." The CEO ended the call. He looked at Bradley as if he were looking at a diseased insect that needed to be exterminated. Then, without saying another word to his son-in-law, the billionaire turned and walked calmly out of the courtroom, leaving his screaming daughter and his ruined executive behind. Bradley's legs finally gave out. The sheer magnitude of his destruction crashed down upon him, crushing his spine and completely obliterating his arrogant facade. He collapsed onto the hard, polished floor of the courtroom. The sharp, expensive fabric of his navy suit wrinkled as his knees hit the wood. He was hyperventilating, dragging oxygen into his lungs in ragged, pathetic gasps. His entire life had just been incinerated in less than 5 minutes. He had no money. He had no wife. He had no powerful family to protect him. He was a thoroughly exposed fraud waiting to be arrested by federal agents. He crawled forward on his hands and knees. The man who had once mocked my pain, the man who had laughed at me while I wept over complex tax documents to pay our mortgage, was now dragging himself across the floor like a beaten dog. He reached out with shaking, sweaty hands and grabbed the hem of my tailored charcoal trousers. "Clara, please." Bradley sobbed, his face looking up at me, completely distorted by terror and grief. Tears and snot ran down his face, soaking into his patchy beard. "Please stop this. Please tell him it is a mistake. I am sorry. I was desperate. I did not know what to do. They are going to put me in prison. The men I owe money to will kill me. Please, Clara. You used to love me. Please help me." I looked down at the pathetic, broken man clinging to my trousers. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering affection, no spark of pity, and no trace of the naive girl who had once baked pies for church bake sales. I remembered the cold, dark entryway of the house he had thrown me out of. I remembered the agonizing pain of giving birth to my son entirely alone, surrounded by sympathetic nurses who thought I was just another tragic statistic. I remembered the desperate, exhausted nights I spent rocking a bassinet while studying forensic accounting laws just to survive. I slowly reached down and firmly grabbed his dirty, sweating wrists. I peeled his fingers off the fabric of my suit, dropping his hands back onto the floor with utter disgust. I took a deliberate step backward, creating a permanent, insurmountable distance between us. "You incinerated your own life the day you decided my son was a disposable burden," I stated. My voice was completely steady, radiating a cold, absolute authority that echoed loudly in the space between us. "You thought you could throw me to the wolves, and you thought you could come back 7 years later to steal the empire I built from the ashes. I simply provided the match." I turned my back on Bradley Preston forever. Harrison was waiting for me at the heavy oak doors, his proud, loving eyes shining with immense respect. I linked my arm through his, completely ignoring the pathetic, wailing sobs of the man writhing on the floor behind me. We walked out of the courtroom together, leaving the cowardly fraud to drown in the magnificent, inescapable hell of his own creation. I had defended my fortress. I had protected my son. The execution was completely flawless, and my family remained beautifully, perfectly untouchable. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind us, sealing the pathetic weeping of Bradley Preston inside that stagnant room. Harrison and I walked shoulder to shoulder down the long marble corridor of the federal courthouse. My posture was perfectly straight, and my breathing was slow and entirely controlled. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the man I had just systematically destroyed. I felt only the profound, pristine clarity of a woman who had successfully defended her family from a dangerous predator. We stepped out through the main glass doors and into the brilliant, blinding sunlight of the New York afternoon. The crisp autumn air hit my face, washing away the suffocating stench of Bradley and his desperate lies. I adjusted the collar of my tailored charcoal suit and looked down the sweeping concrete steps. The execution was not quite finished. I paused at the top of the courthouse steps, resting my hand lightly on Harrison's strong arm. I wanted to witness the absolute final chapter of Bradley's total annihilation. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy glass doors burst open again. Bradley stumbled out into the bright daylight. He was physically trembling, shaking so violently that his expensive navy suit hung awkwardly on his gaunt frame. His face was a sickening shade of pale grey, covered in sweat and the remnants of his fabricated tears. He was looking around wildly, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. At the exact bottom of the concrete steps, 3 dark, unmarked vehicles were parked at harsh, aggressive angles. 6 federal agents wearing dark suits and stern, unyielding expressions stood waiting. They moved with terrifying, synchronized precision the moment Bradley's designer shoes hit the bottom step. They did not shout or make a chaotic spectacle. They simply surrounded him, cutting off every possible avenue of retreat. The lead agent stepped forward and firmly grabbed Bradley by his trembling shoulder. I watched from above as the agent recited the federal charges of grand larceny, wire fraud, and corporate embezzlement. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping around Bradley's wrists echoed loudly in the quiet afternoon air. Bradley did not fight back. His legs completely gave out beneath him, and the federal agents had to physically haul his dead weight toward the back of the armored vehicle. He looked up the concrete steps, and his manic, bloodshot eyes locked onto mine one final time. He saw me standing there, radiating absolute power and untouchable wealth, with my true husband standing solidly by my side. Bradley finally realized the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. He had tried to steal a child from a senior financial partner to pay his illegal gambling debts, and in return, I had personally handed him a guaranteed 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The heavy door of the government vehicle slammed shut, locking the cowardly fraud inside a dark metal cage forever. The unmarked cars pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the busy city traffic and erasing Bradley Preston from our lives permanently. But the absolute justice of the universe did not stop with Bradley. Karma is a meticulous auditor, and it never ever misses an address. While Bradley was being stripped of his expensive suit and processed in a federal holding cell, his wicked sister Abigail was discovering the devastating consequences of her own toxic cruelty. Abigail thought she was completely untouchable when she sat in her comfortable suburban home and filmed that malicious fabricated video. She thought she could weaponize her fake piety and use our old church community to launch a vicious smear campaign against my reputation. She eagerly painted me as a manipulative gold digger to protect her brother, but she was completely unaware of the massive financial sinkhole Bradley had secretly dragged her into. During my relentless overnight audit of Bradley's offshore gambling debts, I had uncovered a fascinating and highly layered secret regarding his private equity loans. Bradley had needed a guarantor to secure the massive amounts of illegal cash he was bleeding to the sportsbooks. He had manipulated his sister, using his position as a wealthy executive at Harrington Logistics, to convince Abigail to co-sign a series of fraudulent high-interest loans. Abigail had blindly signed the legal documents pledging her own home and her personal savings as collateral for a brother she believed was incredibly wealthy. The moment the federal authorities seized Bradley's assets and froze his bank accounts, the aggressive offshore lenders instantly turned their violent attention directly to the co-signer. Before Abigail even had the chance to delete her malicious social media videos, the merciless debt collectors arrived at her front door. The financial ruin was swift and absolutely absolute. The lenders initiated immediate aggressive foreclosure proceedings on her beautiful suburban house. Her personal bank accounts were completely drained to satisfy the mounting penalties and the astronomical interest rates Bradley had accumulated. Abigail lost every single penny she possessed in less than 48 hours. The social destruction was even more agonizing than her financial collapse. When the federal indictment detailing Bradley's $12 million embezzlement scheme was publicly released to the major news outlets, the horrific truth about his character was broadcast to the entire world. The conservative church community that had eagerly consumed Abigail's tragic lies suddenly realized they had been manipulated by a family of deceitful criminals. The women who had briefly supported Abigail's smear campaign instantly turned their backs on her, entirely disgusted by the sheer magnitude of the fraud. Abigail became an absolute pariah. She was publicly disgraced, stripped of her home, and forced to pack her meager belongings into garbage bags, while her former friends watched in silent judgment. She was utterly cast out from the community she had tried to use against me, left to suffer in the desolate, humiliating poverty she so richly deserved. I turned away from the courthouse steps and walked down to the waiting black Mercedes SUV. Thomas, our trusted security detail, held the heavy armored door open for me. I slid into the warm leather seat and Harrison climbed in right beside me. The quiet luxury of the vehicle instantly enveloped us, wrapping us in a thick, comfortable blanket of total security. The engine purred smoothly as Thomas navigated the vehicle out of the congested city streets and headed north toward the lush green hills of the Hudson Valley. We were leaving the dark, chaotic energy of the financial district far behind us. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the headrest. The tight, heavy knot of anxiety that had been coiled in my stomach since the moment Bradley ambushed us at the academy was finally entirely gone. The icy, calculating armor I had worn in the courtroom slowly began to melt away, replaced by a profound, deep-seated warmth. Harrison reached across the center console and gently took my hand. His large, warm fingers laced perfectly through mine. He did not need to say a single word. His strong, silent presence communicated an absolute, unconditional love and a fierce pride that filled every corner of my healing heart. The scenery outside the tinted windows gradually shifted from towering concrete skyscrapers to sweeping ancient oak trees and sprawling emerald green fields. We drove through the heavy wrought iron gates of our private, peaceful estate. The long, winding driveway was lined with tall, beautiful pine trees that offered an impenetrable barrier of natural privacy. The grand stone house sat majestically at the top of the hill, radiating a warm, welcoming light from the large paned windows. This was my true sanctuary. This was the magnificent, bulletproof fortress I had built with my own hands and my own brilliant mind. Thomas parked the SUV near the front steps, and I stepped out into the crisp, clean autumn air. The scent of pine needles and turning leaves filled my lungs, bringing a sudden, wonderful clarity to my senses. I walked around to the expansive backyard, where the manicured green lawn stretched out perfectly toward the tree line. My breath caught in my throat as I looked across the yard. Liam was running freely through the bright green grass, chasing a golden retriever puppy we had adopted just a few weeks prior. My beautiful 7-year-old son was laughing loudly, his pure, joyful voice echoing happily across the peaceful estate. The golden hour sunlight caught the dark waves of his hair, making him look like a radiant, perfect angel. He was wearing his favorite casual clothes, completely relaxed and utterly safe. He had absolutely no idea about the monumental battle that had just concluded in a downtown courtroom. He was completely untouched by the darkness, the greed, and the sociopathic cruelty of his biological father. To Liam, the world was still a fundamentally beautiful, secure place filled with endless love and infinite possibilities. Harrison walked up close behind me, wrapping his strong arms securely around my waist. He rested his chin affectionately on my shoulder, and we stood together in perfect silence, watching our son play in the warm afternoon sun. I leaned back into the solid, reassuring warmth of my true husband. I watched Liam tackle the puppy tumbling into the soft grass with a chorus of innocent, delighted giggles. A profound, overwhelming wave of absolute peace washed through my entire body. I thought about the terrified, weeping woman who had been discarded in a cold hospital room 7 years ago. She felt so distant now, like a frail shadow from another lifetime. I had buried that submissive, naive girl and forged a terrifying, calculating apex predator in her place. I had weaponized my intellect, my endurance, and my ferocious maternal instinct to completely eradicate every single threat to my family. I had audited my enemies, stripped them of their power, and sent them plummeting into the absolute abyss of their own making. I had protected my bloodline with sheer unapologetic strength, and I had secured a future so bright and so wealthy that the darkness could never ever reach us again. Women can sacrifice, but we must never be foolish. When backed into a corner, use your intellect as a weapon and show them your true strength. If you feel satisfied with this ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. What time is it where you are watching this video, and where are you from? Let me know in the comments below.